LoveLore Library. Chapter 374, Not Afraid of a Little Spice. 1. Chu Lien smiled after seeing Sima Hui's reaction. It looked like the teppanyaki suited her tastes. Wenlan served up another bowl of lamb organ soup for everyone. Chu Lien held up her bowl with two hands and sipped slowly. Since the soup was piping hot, her cheeks were flushed red from the heart. She said, "This isn't anything fancy, it's made from lamb intestines. It's good for keeping your body warm though." The intestines of cows, sheep and pigs were not considered good ingredients in the Great Wu dynasty. They were seen as some byproducts of killing livestock. Only the families who were really poor and couldn't afford other types of ingredients would eat them. Everyone had been drinking the soup happily. Upon hearing the truth from Chu Lien, their eyes almost popped out of their sockets. Captain Guo was in absolute disbelief. He looked at his empty bowl and looked again at the steaming pot of soup boiling over the brazier. "Is this really made from lamb intestines?" Chu Lien blinked. "Didn't you just eat it for yourself?" Once Captain Guo had confirmed the truth with Chu Lien, he slapped his leg in anger and his whole person seemed to sag. He looked rather depressed. Chu Lien found it strange and didn't understand why Captain Guo had such a huge reaction. She set down the bowl in her hands. "Brother Guo, please don't worry. Although this soup is made from lamb intestines, Wenqing and Wenlan have already cleaned them thoroughly. You won't get ill from eating this." The people of the Great Wu dynasty didn't dare to eat intestines because some people had fallen ill after eating them. As the news passed by word of mouth, it became that no one dared to eat intestines any longer. It was true that it was easy to get infected with some sort of bacteria or virus by eating unclean animal organs. However, as long as the organs were washed carefully, there wouldn't be any problems. He Changdi drank a mouthful of the soup. For some reason, although he was absolutely starving, when he saw how Chu Lien was ignoring him, he just couldn't muster up any appetite. Zhang Mai shook his head. He was the one who understood Captain Guo the most here. "Honored lady, it's not what you think. Captain Guo is regretting how he threw away all the intestines before this. The border army had slaughtered livestock like cows and sheep to preserve the meat for winter. Those intestines and organs had been immediately thrown away and buried. If they had known that these organs could be made into such a delicious soup, they wouldn't have wasted a single cow intestine. If they had kept those organs, their army would have a few more days of supplies." The party had only come over for a free meal. No one expected the mood to turn depressing so suddenly. Captain Guo, Zhang Mai, and Xiao Hongyu all sunk into silence. He Changdi's face had been cold from the start. Sima Hui joined them with an expression of deep thought. Chu Lien really hadn't expected a simple bowl of lamb organ soup to have provoked such reactions from them. She rolled her eyes speechlessly. What was the use of regretting it now? Those organs had long been buried. By now, the organs must be decomposing naturally. Even if they regretted it, it wasn't as if they could dig up the organs and eat them now. Wasn't it good enough to take note of this knowledge and apply it in the future? While Chu Lien was remaining calm, it didn't mean that the others shared her open-mindedness. Wenqing and Wenlan were getting anxious watching them. Once the atmosphere in the tent had taken a turn for the worse, the two sisters' actions had become more careful as they continued grilling meat. Wenlan's hand trembled, accidentally moving the chest plate and causing it to make an ear-piercing screech as it rubbed against the steel wire mesh it was balanced upon. Following that, it wobbled and fell off the wire mesh, letting out a clear cling-clang. Everyone was jolted back to their senses and they turned towards the sound in unison. Wenqing and Wenlan's faces turned pale as they tried their best to blend into the walls. When 6 pairs of eyes focused on the object still shaking and wobbling on the floor, they shared a sense of familiarity. This round plate didn't seem like a wok. Although it had been charred black by the fire in the center and was covered in glistening oil, the sides that hadn't been burned looked like shiny golden metal. They were all officers in the army and for all soldiers shared the same style of armor apart from the generals. Even Sima Hui's armor looked about the same, except for the 2 chest plates in the front. Suddenly, in uncoordinated unison, everyone turned towards the armor hanging on the wooden rack in the tent and sweat drops seemed to form simultaneously on their faces. Chu Lian immediately realized that they had found out that her teppanyaki plate was the chest plate on He Sanlang's armor. However, she had already used it right in front of them, so it wasn't good to explain too much at this moment. Anyway, they had all eaten it together. They couldn't scold her now after eating her food. Chu Lian was very thick-skinned. She acted as if it were nothing. He Changdi was the first to lose his temper. He cast a cold gaze over the defaced chest plate and pressed his lips together. With gritted teeth, he shouted, "Chu Lian! Is this your doing?" After getting shouted at by He Sanlang, Chu Lian did feel a little guilty. She tried to soften him up by giving him a sweet smile. The group saw that tension was rising between the couple, so they immediately made their escape. Sima Hui hadn't expected that the normally cool and reserved He Sanlang had moments where he showed his anger. She stared in stunned astonishment. Xiao Hongyu stood outside the tent in the cold and breezy night. "Brother Gua, Brother Zhang, let me sleep over in your tent tonight." Brother, he was way too scary just now. The two of them completely ignored Xiao Hongyu's request and ran away as fast as they could. Sima Hui stood outside the tent with a smile. She really hadn't expected to see that was how He Changdi and his wife got along. When that calm, intelligent and cold He Sanlang was in front of honored Lady Jeannie, it was as if his divine aura had suddenly been lifted and he had become a real, living human being with emotions, rather than a cruel and heartless robot. The couple seemed to be getting along very well. How could anyone possibly get in between them? Xiaoyan had really been too naive. When she thought of Xiaoyan, Sima Hui let a long sigh. She left Xiaoju behind with some instructions before bringing the rest of her party back to her tent. TL note, my editor reminded me that CL's actions are very similar to this. There's a YouTube channel where a Chinese lady called Ms. Ye uses random things in her office to cook food in the coolest and weirdest of ways. XD, go check out her videos and be amazed. Chapter 375, Not Afraid of a Little Spice. 2. Only He Sanlang and Chu Lian were left in the tent now. Wenqing and Wenlan had already made their escape. If this had been a normal day, Chu Lian would definitely have been stubborn and hard-headed. However, she just couldn't summon up her courage today. She snuck a glance at the missing space in front of the armor and made a silent prayer for herself. Her body had just been warmed up by the soup, but now her lunatic husband had gone and made things all cold again. When she looked at how He Sanlang was sitting up straight at the side without moving, as if he were a statue, Chu Lian felt extremely awkward. After a long moment of silence, Chu Lian lost her patience first. "It was my mistake today. I'll compensate you with another set of armor." He Changdi looked straight at his wife, who had her head slightly lowered. All the anger in him had already disappeared when their guests had left. Seeing how she had shrunk back into herself like a scared little bunny, the reprimand that he had been about to unleash remained stuck in his throat. Thinking back to the snow boat that she had gifted to him this morning, He Changdi's heart softened. This woman had thought about him at the first moment. She had given him that precious blueprint without any caution at all. No one knew the value of that snowboat better than he did. His image of her was slowly pulling away from the wicked woman from his previous life. When he thought of that, He Sanlang's frozen heart melted into a pile of water, as if spring had already come. The issue with the armor became inconsequential to him. Looking again at the timid-looking Chu Lian, he just couldn't bear to speak any words of scolding. Luckily, He Changdi was the kind who kept his guard up and his thoughts to himself. He wouldn't share his thoughts just like that. Otherwise, if Chu Lian were to reveal the real reason for giving him the snowboat rather than presenting it herself, he would be the one to puke blood in anger. Chu Lian was still waiting for her lunatic husband to scold her with her head lowered. Who could have thought that she wouldn't hear anything from He Changdi at all, even though her neck was already starting to hurt? She looked up and cast a quick glance at He Changdi, only to realize that he was looking at her with that deep gaze of his. The emotions swirling in his eyes were just too strange. Chu Lian shivered. Why did she feel like he was going to eat her up in the next instant? After getting caught by Chu Lian, He Changdi shifted his gaze away and coughed awkwardly. Following that, he picked up the chest plate from the floor. Under Chu Lian's frightened gaze, he wiped the chest plate clean and placed it back over the brazier. He moved a plate of raw beef slices that hadn't been grilled in front of Chu Lian. Cook this. Chu Lian thought that she was hallucinating and replied with a dazed, "Ah." He Changdi tried his best to adjust his expression and make it as neutral as possible, instead of cool. "I didn't eat just now. I'm still hungry." Chu Lian shot a doubtful glance at him. She hadn't been watching him just now, so she didn't know if he was speaking the truth. Had he really not eaten at all just now? When He Changdi's eyes met hers, Chu Lian could only admit defeat and help him grill the meat. As Chu Lian skillfully flipped the beef slices on the metal plate, the meat made sizzling sounds. She took up the plate of seasoning at the side and asked, "Do you eat spicy food?" He Changdi was staring at Chu Lian's fair hands, lost in thought. He didn't seem to hear Chu Lian's question at all. Chu Lian made an exaggerated roll of her eyes. What was going on with her lunatic husband? It was bad enough that he had chased everyone out of the tent. Now he was making her cook for him personally. However, when she asked him what flavor he would like to have, he was actually being absent-minded. Chu Lian continued complaining in her heart and accidentally shook her hand twice, adding in twice the usual amount of chili powder. Hee. Since you're not going to reply, I'll let you have all the spice. She finished grilling the beef slices quickly and placed them neatly on a plate. They looked delicious and alluring. Chu Lian personally set the dish in front of He Sanlang. He Sanlang stared at the grilled beef slices in front of him, finally feeling satisfied. His wife should only care for him alone and cook for him alone. Although He Changdi was happy within, there wasn't much change in his expression. Chu Lian sat back down next to him and watched as he used his wooden chopsticks to put a slice of meat into his mouth. In the next second, He Changdi's body stiffened up for an instant before returning to normal. He Sanlang ate very elegantly. Even though he was moving his chopsticks quickly, his motions were still a joy to watch. As Chu Lian watched him devour piece after piece until all the meat on the plate was gone, her eyes widened in shock. What was going on? Had He Changdi been born in Sichuan in his previous life? How was he so good at eating spicy food? She had been the one to grill the meat and she had brought the chili powder over from the capital. She knew very well how spicy it was. Chu Lian was already considered someone who could hold her spice. The chili powder that she had made was already spicy enough when she used about a fingernail's worth of it. When she had been cooking the meat for He Changdi, she had used 2 to 3 times the usual amount. His expression hadn't even changed when he had been eating that meat, as if nothing unusual had happened. If not for the lack of any spicy seasoning like this chili powder in the Great Wu Dynasty, Chu Lian might have suspected that he was the kind to eat only spicy food. However, Chu Lian found out very quickly that she was wrong. Chapter 376, It's Hard to Say Sorry. 1. Chu Lian stared at He Sanlang in astonishment. Isn't it spicy? He Changdi's thin lips were slightly swollen. He licked them and continued his pretense of calm. It was okay. Chu Lian's eyes focused on his face, her almond-shaped eyes seemingly trying to discern whether he had been telling the truth. Her gaze drifted down to his neck. He Changdi's skin was fair and the clothes he had on now were a dark color, making the color of the skin on his neck even more obvious. His originally pale skin was now completely flushed red. There was also a thin layer of sweat on his neck, indicating that he Changdi probably hadn't been telling the truth. Chu Lian went into a daze for a moment before she shifted her gaze away to the unassuming dark green collar on his neck. The collar peeking out was from the undershirt he wore within. Although it was just a tiny sliver of collar, Chu Lian managed to recognize the undershirt instantly. This was definitely the undershirt that Li Yu had embroidered that Wenqing had accidentally packed for him. Dark green was an unassuming color, so it shouldn't be noticeable when worn on the inside. However, since it was Li Yu's first time doing embroidery, she wasn't very good at picking a matching thread color. Although it was a dark-colored shirt and she had intended on doing some patterns on the collar, she should have picked something closer to the shirt's color. However, Li Yu had picked out some shiny thread with the color of autumn leaves, thus making the crooked embroidery on the collar especially obvious. It was extremely eye-catching. Chu Lian fell into a daze and stared at the embroidery for too long, causing He Sanlang to notice that something was wrong. He looked downwards and realized that he was still wearing the undershirt that his wife had embroidered for him. His ears flushed red instantly. The atmosphere within the tent was slowly turning a little weird. When Chu Lian finally regained her senses, her face wrinkled up into a strange expression. She knew that He Changdi had probably assumed that that undershirt was her handiwork. She was trapped in a dilemma now. Should she tell him the truth or not? Once she thought of the fits of insanity that He Changdi seemed prone to from time to time, she decided to remain silent on the matter for the sake of her own safety. If the truth ever came to light, she could honestly say that she had never claimed to have any part in making that undershirt. However, Chu Lian still felt a little guilty for now. She turned and poured a cup of warm water for him, explaining kindly, "The taste of the grilled beef is a little strong. Why don't you have some warm water to rinse away the flavor?" He Sanlang coughed twice to hide his struggle before nodding. When he took the cup, he immediately drained it in one gulp. Chu Lian secretly watched from the side. Upon seeing how urgently he was drinking the water, she knew that she had guessed correctly. She thought back to how he had been eating so fervently and she felt a little touched. If they had switched places and she had been the one served with those extremely spicy beef slices, she probably wouldn't have been able to down a single one. They were just like a loving couple. The husband would eat his wife's cooking without complaint, regardless of how it tasted, because it was made by his wife. For the sake of making her happy, he would pretend to love eating the food and polish off every last bit of food on the plate. Chu Lian realized that He Changdi had the habit of never wasting any food. He had been like this even back at Songtao Court and even more so when eating that terrible bean paste. Although He Sanlang's personality was too aloof sometimes and he would have random periods of insanity from time to time, her heart softened immediately. She wanted to treat him a little better. She promised to herself never to tease him in that manner ever again, and to always cook delicious food for him. Once He Sanlang got over the burning feeling in his mouth, he sipped a mouthful of lamb organ soup. He pressed his lips together in hesitation before finally gathering the courage to say, "Chu Lian, many thanks to you for your help." Chu Lian blinked in surprise and the corners of her lips curled up. It was just a small suggestion. "It's good if it'll be useful to you." She acted so casually that He Sanlang didn't know what else to say. The depths of his eyes were as fathomless as the night sky, dotted with the light of faraway stars, as thoughts ran through his mind. He Changdi finally let go of the unseen chains tying his mind to his past life. Although many things were similar, there were just as many changes in this life. Everything seemed to have been reset. How could he be sure that the Chu Lian before him was the same Chu Lian from his past life? Other than sharing the same face, their personalities were completely different. He no longer wanted to escape reality. Despite how much he wanted to argue against it, a voice was calling out from deep within and reminding him that he had already fallen in love with the Chu Lian right in front of him. This was an unavoidable truth that he didn't want to admit. Chu Lian had described how she had invented the snowboat as if it was a normal everyday thing to do, and it had indeed been as easy as drinking and eating for her. However, that wasn't what He Sanlang thought. After getting hurt so deeply and encasing himself in unbreakable ice, He Changdi had thought that he would never develop feelings for any woman ever again. Who could have expected that his heart would fall for his greatest sworn enemy? It was fortunate that his personality was strong enough to withstand this turn of events, or he might have made himself go crazy for real. There was a period of silence within the tent that made Chu Lian feel like years had passed instead of just minutes. She adjusted her skirt and wondered whether she should try to take her leave. It was only then that she suddenly heard He Changdi's low, magnetic voice speaking. "Chu Lian, let's get along well from now on." Chapter 377, It's hard to say sorry, too. He Changdi had used up every bit of courage in his body to say those words. However, after speaking, he found that he had only become even more nervous. His gaze subconsciously landed on Chu Lian's face. There was no good way to describe what Chu Lian's expression looked like now. The closest approximation was like she had stepped in dog poop. Sigh. This lunatic He Sanlang. When had she ever not tried to get along with him? She had focused on cooking good food to raise her standard of living, respected her elders and even earnestly started a business to earn money. She was living perfectly well. She wasn't the one throwing fits of lunacy since their wedding night. Chu Lian fought the urge to smile out of overwhelming anger. Wasn't it lucky for him that she was the He family's third young madam? If he had said that to any other noble lady, wouldn't they have expired on the spot from frustration? When He Changdi noticed the mocking expression on Chu Lian's face, his body froze up and his lips pressed together into a thin line as his expression turned colder and colder. The hands hidden under his sleeves slowly tensed into fists. He wanted to speak, but he found that he couldn't say a word when faced with the sort of expression on Chu Lian's face. Chu Lian tilted her head to the side and started examining the tall He Sanlang the Fair, who would still tower over her by half a head even when seated. At this moment, He Sanlang's fine features were contorted with tension. There was an aura of restraint around him, as if he was a dog trying to suppress the feelings of having been abandoned by his master. Chu Lian smiled. "He Changdi, what's with that pitiful act? It's not like I abandoned you." He Sanlang's current expression was extremely entertaining. He stared at Chu Lian with wide eyes. Her reply had been completely out of his expectations. Before he could gather his wits to summon a reply, Chu Lian continued her tirade. "Haven't you realized it yet? I've always been trying to get along with you. Otherwise, why would I have come all the way out to this poor and desolate place? Why else would I be sitting right next to you now? Are you taking me for a fool?" The fog covering He Sanlang's eyes seemed to have lifted in an instant. Shame and guilt flashed through his eyes. Chu Lian's mocking words felt like a slap to his face. Although it didn't hurt, he was still upset. That's right. Hadn't he been the one determined not to get along with her? Although he hadn't caused any physical or fatal harm to Chu Lian's body, ever since their wedding day, all of his actions had been damaging Chu Lian's reputation and self-respect. How hilarious. How could he have had the guts to ask Chu Lian to get along well with him? He deserved every word of ridicule from her. He Sanlang pressed his lips and parted them, yet he just couldn't let a single sound out. The smile on Chu Lian's face slowly faded away. She looked up at that handsome face with her almond-shaped eyes. "He Changdi, is it so hard to say that you're sorry?" Chu Lian no longer wanted to wait for his apology. She abruptly stood up, but her legs were numb from kneeling down for too long. Her body refused to listen to her commands and wavered. Changdi was about to reach out to support her, but Chu Lian recovered her balance and stabilized herself before he could do so. Changdi's outstretched arms looked pitifully lonely and useless. He lowered them in desolation. Chu Lian watched all this happen, but her heart was set. Changdi, it's getting late. Lieutenant Xiao must be suffering in the cold wind outside. You have a mission to carry out tomorrow as well, so I'll stop bothering you. After leaving behind these words, Chu Lian turned and quickly left. Although her figure seemed slender and weak, she moved faster than expected. She was already long gone by the time Changdi thought to chase after her. When Chu Lian stepped out of the tent, the cold northern winds were like a slap to her face, instantly calming down her tumultuous emotions. Chu Lian took in a deep breath, but her expression didn't improve. The tent had muffled all the sounds from inside, so Xiao Hongyu, Wenqing and Wenlan didn't know what the couple had discussed. However, judging from Chu Lian's expression, all of them could tell that the couple had fought. Wenlan quickly hurried forward to wrap a cloak around Chu Lian. Xiaoju stepped up to welcome her. Honored lady, our general has charged this subordinate with the duty of leading honored lady to a place to sleep. Captain Gua had been intending to send Chu Lian over to the women's camp for the night anyway. It was even better that Sima Hui had sent one of her most trusted adjutants over to lead Chu Lian there personally. Chu Lian smiled at Xiaoju. She wasn't an unreasonable person. Then I'll be troubling your general. I'll head over right now. Although it was Xiaoju's first time interacting with Chu Lian, she felt that it was easy to interact with the baby-faced honored Lady Genie. Her personality was also straightforward, unlike most of the noble ladies in the capital. Xiaoju was already used to living in the army with her mistress, so she hated the way that noble ladies would talk in circles with hidden meanings. It was better to be honest and direct in everything. Chu Lian followed Xiaoju to Sima Hui's tent with Wenqing and Wenlan behind her. When Sanlang came out of his tent, all that he caught was Chu Lian's slender back walking into the flurry of snow. Noticing that Changdi's expression was very gloomy, Xiao Hongyu acted appropriately for once and said, Brother sister-in-law has gone over to General Sima's camp. Don't worry, Brother Gua has already made a proper request to General Sima, the general won't mistreat sister-in-law. Changdi didn't reply Xiao Hongyu. He simply stood at the tent entrance and watched until Chu Lian's silhouette had completely faded into the darkness of the snowy night. He finally turned around and returned to the tent. However, for some reason, when he heard from Xiao Hongyu that Sima Hui had sent her trusted female adjutant to welcome Chu Lian, there was a hint of upset in his heart. Chapter 378, Getting Along with Sima Hui. 1. Sima Hui didn't arrange another tent for Chu Lian. Firstly, it was already quite late. Secondly, even if she arranged for another tent, it wouldn't be as comfortable as her own. The two of them were women and the soldiers outside were all female too, so it was much more convenient than it was at the right-wing army's camp. It was the coldest it ever got at the northern border now, where sticking out your hands meant risking possible frostbite, yet it was warm as spring in Sima Hui's tent. Chu Lian had visited the tent once before, but that was when the owner hadn't been around. This time, when she followed Xiaoju into the tent, Sima Hui personally came over to welcome her in. She had already changed out of the military outfit she normally wore in the day. Right now, she was wearing a loose and comfortable light pink set of inner clothes. Her ink-black hair was let loose to fall over her shoulders while two locks of her fringe framed the sides of her face, softening her bold features and giving them a hint of womanly charm. Sima Hui was so tall that the crown of her head surpassed Chu Lian's by half a head when she stood next to her. She walked behind Chu Lian and said warmly, "Honored lady, please come over here and have a seat. Warm yourself up by the fire." Following that, she ordered Xiaoju to serve some tea. Chu Lian followed Sima Hui and sat down next to the brazier. General Sima, you don't have to stand on ceremony with me. I don't drink sencha, so Xiaoju won't have to busy herself with brewing tea. You don't have to call me honored lady either, you can use my name. Sima Hui smiled, then you don't have to call me General Sima either, Lianer. I'm older than you by a few years, so why don't you call me Sister Hui like my cousins do? Chu Lian hadn't expected Sima Hui to get so familiar, but it would be impolite to reject her now. Thus, she nodded, then I'll be thick-skinned with you, Sister Hui. This tent was outfitted for a female general after all. Everything in Sima Hui's tent was of good quality. Even though the tent wasn't very big, the furniture within was exquisite. There was even a small incense burner in a corner of the tent, giving off a faint watery fragrance that calmed the mind and relaxed the body. Compared with Yichangdi's ordinary tent, it was like comparing between heaven and earth. However, for some reason, although Sima Hui's tent was very cozy, Chu Lian just didn't feel as comfortable as she was in Yichangdi's simple tent. Sima Hui ordered Xiaoju and 2 more female soldiers to add another bed next to her own. Wenqing and Wenlan set it up with thick bedding and a fleece blanket, and that was to be Chu Lian's bed for the night. Chu Lian had the habit of sleeping in, especially in such a cold place like the north. Back in Liangzhou's He estate, she would sleep till noon before getting up. However, this morning, the moment Chu Lian heard some movement from Sima Hui right next to her, she woke right up. Sima Hui was already standing behind the privacy screen and changing into her set of silver armor. Chu Lian sat up on the bed, a little groggy. Sima Hui noticed Chu Lian getting up and how dazed she looked. Any hint of the intelligence she had seen yesterday was gone. Chu Lian's soft hair was slightly disheveled from sleep and her cheeks were red. Her young age and small body size also gave Sima Hui the urge to treat her like her real younger cousin. Unbeknownst to her, her tone now carried a trace of warmth when she spoke. It's still early. Why don't you continue sleeping, Lianer? I'm going out to train my soldiers. After sitting for a while, Chu Lian had already fully woken up, so she didn't feel like going back to sleep. She replied in a soft tone with a hint of sleepiness, It's okay, Sister Hui. I'll get up now. Sima Hui didn't stop her. However, since it was so rare to see Chu Lian so dazed, she couldn't resist the urge to pet that messy head of hair. When Wenqing and Wenlan walked past the entrance screen, that was the scene that greeted them. They somehow felt that General Sima's actions seemed a little weird. Yichangdi had gotten up especially early on this day. When he walked out of his tent, the sun was barely reaching out across the horizon. He did a set of boxing exercises outside his tent and broke a wooden post before a soldier came over to report that General Sima was awake and having breakfast with honored lady in her tent. He froze for a moment before gritting his teeth and asking, Have you found honored lady's maidservants? The soldier felt that the air around his officer was turning a little too chilly. He trembled as he replied, Why yes, this subordinate has found them. Yichangdi's cold gaze focused on the soldier, whose knees started knocking together. Miss Wenqing said that Captain should take care of his own body. They'll serve honored lady so Captain doesn't need to worry about them. Did Wenqing pass on any message from honored lady for me? The corners of the soldier's mouth twitched and he hesitated. In the end, he still reported the truth, not daring to lie to his superior officer, and no, scram. The soldier staggered and stumbled as he ran away, nearly tripping over himself. It wasn't until he could no longer see his captain that he wiped at his forehead. Captain had been way too scary just now. On a dry winter day like this, he had actually broken out into cold sweat. Sanlang was extremely angry now. He paced furiously outside his tent. He finally seemed to think of something and quickly returned to his tent. After about 15 minutes, Lai Wei hurried into the tent after him. Third young master, do you have any urgent orders for this servant? Changdi nodded. Liyue immediately focused 120% of his attention on his master and waited for his orders. Have you given the sugarcane that you brought back yesterday to your third young madam yet? Liyue blanked out for a moment. Was this the urgent business that third young master had summoned him for? Although he was a little disappointed, Liyue still replied honestly. Not yet. This servant was in a rush to report the news after meeting third young madam on the way to Liangzhou city yesterday, so this servant hasn't given her the sugarcane. A rare hint of joy appeared on He Sanlang's face. Bring the sugarcane here, I'll send it to her myself. Liyue secretly glanced at his third young master. Although he had some suspicions in his heart, he didn't dare to question his master and immediately agreed. This servant will go and bring it here. Chapter 379. It's hard to say sorry, too. Xiao Hongyu wasn't in the tent now. After Liyue left, Changdi continued pacing within his tent frantically. He started rubbing the green jade ring that Chu Lian had given him that he was wearing on his right thumb. It seemed like his heart would only calm down if he did so. Chu Lian had been intending to leave today. However, Sima Hui persuaded her to stay one more day. With Sima Hui as her guide, it became much more convenient for Chu Lian to take a tour around the border army camp. She could even take a peek at the female soldiers' training grounds. Chu Lian didn't know how to ride, so Sima Hui's adjutant Xiaoju picked out a gentle mare for her and helped her onto the horse's back. Following that, Xiaoju got on her own horse and helped to lead Chu Lian's mare around. It was Chu Lian's first time riding a horse, so she was excited. Sima Hui accompanied her on her own handsome snow-white steed, pointing out the sights in the camp and explaining the details to her from time to time. Chu Lian learned a lot on this little trip. With her fur cloak wrapped around her, despite the strong winds turning her cheeks red, she didn't feel cold at all. Her mood remained high and excited throughout the day. How often would she get the chance to be shown around the northern border camp by a female general? Of course Chu Lian was going to seize the opportunity and make the most of it. Sima Hui took off the red fox fur hat on her head and passed it over to Chu Lian. Lianer, why don't you wear this? This will be warmer than that hood on your cloak. Chu Lian looked the smiling Sima Hui. Seeing that Xiaoju had already passed another hat to Sima Hui, she didn't turn down the offer and took the hat over. She pulled down her hood and put the hat on her head. Since they were in an army camp right now, she had chosen a simple hairstyle. She didn't have many accessories on her head either, and half of her hair was let loose behind her back, so nothing got in the way of the hat. She was wearing on a red cotton-padded dress with pomegranate flowers embroidered on it, paired with an additional short vest on her upper body. The sleeves of her vest and the hem of her skirt were covered in a layer of white rabbit fur. Wrapped around her was a thick pink cloak. Sima Hui's red fox fur hat turned out to be rather matching with her outfit for today. Most of her black hair was covered by the hat, which also had a ring of round white pearls. There were even a few strands of pearls hanging on either side of her temple, forming miniature curtains. The pearl strands swayed with every step of the horse underneath her, highlighting her fair face and flushed cheeks and making her seem even more dazzling. Sima Hui was very satisfied upon seeing Chu Lian's outfit completed by her hat. She pointed to the left. Lianer, the right-wing army's training grounds are over there. Captain Gua, Captain He and the other officers usually train their soldiers there. Chu Lian's gaze followed where Sima Hui was pointing and was immediately met with the sight of He Changdi looking over from far away. Despite the distance between them and despite not being able to see He Changdi's face clearly at this distance, she was absolutely sure that He Changdi was looking at her right now, perhaps due to her women's intuition. Chu Lian didn't greet him at all. Instead, she followed Sima Hui on a path around the borders of the male camp, checking out other areas of interest. He San Lang was skilled in martial arts and his five senses were much more sensitive than most people. Furthermore, Chu Lian's outfit today was rather eye-catching. It was hard for him not to notice her. Think about it. Most of the people in the army were wearing dull gray armor. Even Sima Hui's female soldiers were dressed in similar outfits. It was impossible for Chu Lian not to stand out in her red clothes. Not only that, He San Lang had been watching from the start as Sima Hui had taken off her own hat for Chu Lian to wear. Sima Hui was dressed in silver armor with a bright red cloak behind her. She had a lanky figure and carried herself with a heroic bearing. Her waist and back were straight and she had a red-tipped spear strapped to her back. She even had a handsome white horse under her. When she was riding next to Chu Lian, if no one looked closely, they wouldn't look like two women at all. Instead, they would seem like a young couple deeply in love. Especially when Sima Hui had taken off her hat and given it to Chu Lian to wear. He Changdi was hopping mad within. Sima Hui had instantly taken the top spot on the list of people he hated. His eyes were like daggers as he focused on Chu Lian, fighting his urge to rush over there immediately. However, that wicked woman pretended as if she hadn't seen him and walked away. Thus, Captain He's subordinates suffered through hell today. After the training ended, all of the soldiers were grabbing onto their sore waists and legs and crying for their mothers. Wasn't it bad enough that they hadn't had a full meal in days? Why were they still being tortured through training like this? Had they offended the heavens somehow? Once he was done training his troops, He Changdi took Liua with him and headed for Sima Hui's tent. He made a trip back to his own tent to change out of his clothes first. When Xiao Hongyu spotted him taking out a gray set of inner clothes from his wooden chest, he had come over curiously with a bright smile. "Brother He, you're finally going to stop wearing that dark green tunic." "Hee, I even made a bet with Brother Zhang to see when you were going to change out of that. It looks like it's my win." The end result of Xiao Hongyu's teasing was getting punched. Of course, he didn't dare to return the blow. Chu Lian and Sima Hui were eating snacks in her tent. Xiaoju set down a plate of nicely cut sugarcane on the table. Chapter 380, Gathering Grain. 1. The bad weather, harsh climate and geography of the land meant that the northern border wasn't suited for planting grains. Even if they tried to plant some crops, the harvest would be dismal. That was why the disgusting Chinese olive porridge was so precious to the people here. Since grain crops couldn't survive in the northern border, fruit trees were a mere dream. This was also winter. Even in the capital, the types of fruit available in the middle of winter were just some frozen pears or tangerines. Even Chu Lian, who seemed to have prepared an entire larder for herself, hadn't brought any fresh fruits with her. When she was craving for some fruit, the most she could do was to have some candied kumquats. Thus, when Sima Hui served up some juicy and sweet sugarcane, she was overwhelmed by the luxurious treat. Chu Lian knew perfectly well what the soldiers in the camp were going through now. When Xiaoju saw that honored Lady Jeannie was looking at the white porcelain dish containing the sugarcane with surprise, she smiled and explained, "The general brought these over from Sioux City. Since the weather hasn't been very good, some of the sugarcane was spoiled by the frost. The only ones we have left are here." When Chu Lian heard that, she didn't feel like eating the sugarcane any longer. She pushed the dish towards Sima Hui. It wasn't easy to have kept this sugarcane for so long. "Sister Hui, you should have it instead." Sima Hui smiled gently, "I don't like to eat sweet things." "Lianer, go ahead and eat it. The only reason I even have these is because Sioux City had an abundant harvest of sugarcane. I bought them while passing by with my subordinates. If you feel bad, then you can make some salty snacks for me." Chu Lian did have a sweet tooth, as could be seen from how she always drank honey water without any hint of getting tired of it. Since Sima Hui had already explained her reasons, it would be impolite for Chu Lian to refuse the sugarcane. Her lips curled up into a smile. Since Sister Hui has already offered it to me, I won't stand on ceremony. Chu Lian used the toothpicks placed next to the dish to pick up a piece and put it in her mouth. The sugarcane had been kept well and it was still very juicy. She chewed it forcefully, bringing out the sweet juice within and filling her mouth with the unique taste of the sugarcane. This taste was completely different from eating candied kumquats. Chu Lian quickly crunched her way through 5 pieces. Although her actions weren't as elegant as those of noble-born ladies, the way she ate made anyone watching her hungry too. When Sima Hui saw how happily she was eating, she picked up a piece of sugarcane and ate it as well, even though she normally didn't like sweet things. Thus, the scene that greeted He Changdi when he entered the tent was his dear wife sitting at the table and happily gnawing away at sugarcane. Of course, the scene wasn't complete without Sima Hui staring at Chu Lian with a warm and gentle gaze. There was a small plate on the table where Chu Lian had spat out the remains of the sugarcane after chewing on them. The amount of sugarcane mush there was like a thorn in He Changdi's eye. Now the bag of sugarcane he was carrying on his back had become hard to give away. When Liyue followed his young master into the tent and was met with the same scene, he was filled with regret. Why was third young madam having sugarcane here in General Sima's tent? If only he had brought back some fruits instead. Why did he have to bring back sugarcane? He Sanlang had come in rather abruptly. He had charged right in without waiting for the guard outside. It was then that the female guard came in to report her lapse while trembling. Sima Hui waved her hand and sent the guard back out without any punishment. Chu Lian's cheeks were slightly puffed up since she hadn't finished chewing on the piece of sugarcane in her mouth. She blinked and stared as she spoke. The food in her mouth made her words muffled. He Jiangdi, why are you here? He Sanlang turned around and threw the bag in his hands to Liyue before turning back to Chu Lian. He replied her in a cool tone, what? Can't I come over to take a look at my wife? Chu Lian frowned and spat out the sugarcane bits in her mouth. She was extremely vexed. What was wrong with her lunatic husband now? He Changdi's eyes shifted towards the table not too far away from him. He noticed that there were a few types of fine-looking confections displayed there and realized that he hadn't eaten any of them before. He didn't even have to think to know that those had definitely been made by Chu Lian or one of her maidservants. Even he hadn't tried any of those before as her husband. However, she had brought them out now to suck up to Sima Hui. As the anger within him grew, his expression grew even more frosty. He suppressed the frustration in his heart and said, since you're clearly eating and drinking well, I'll take my leave now. He Sanlang left as hurriedly as he had come. Before Chu Lian could even say a word, he had already swept the tent flap up and left the tent. The short exchange between the couple left Sima Hui gaping in shock. The corner of her lip tugged downwards in sympathy as she turned to Chu Lian. Lianer, do you have to chase after him? Chu Lian rolled her eyes. What should she chase him for? Had Sima Hui gotten their roles in reverse somehow? Why did she, as a woman, have to chase out after her unreasonable husband? There's no need to. He's always been like that. Liyue was still in the tent. When he heard his young madam's reply, the corner of his mouth twitched. He didn't want to see his master's efforts go to waste, so he purposely let one side of the bag slip, revealing the sugarcane within. He turned to third young madam with a troubled expression and started saying, third young madam, this, Chu Lian wasn't blind. Liyue had been too obvious in his actions, so she had definitely seen what was inside the bag. Her lips tugged downwards and she seemed a little helpless. Just make your own way back first. I'll visit him later on. After getting Chu Lian's promise, Liyue let out a silly and bright smile. He bowed respectfully to her before turning and leaving. TL note, I usually drink sugarcane juice and I've never chewed on them like CL's doing, but sugarcane does taste really nice. It's also where most of our processed sugar comes from. 3 sugarcane slices. Chapter 381, Gathering Grain. 2. At dusk, Chu Lian brought Wenqing and Wenlan with her to Hechangdi's tent, without forgetting to bring over a small box of confections too. However, when Chu Lian reached the tent, she was informed by one of the guards that he had already left the camp with some of his men. He hadn't given a date when he would be back. Chu Lian was astounded. Just as she was about to go looking for someone familiar to ask about the reason behind Hechangdi's departure, Captain Gua happened to pass by. He led her into Hechangdi's tent. Sister-in-law, Zixiang left the camp in the afternoon. Captain Gua turned to the wooden chest next to the bed and pulled out a bag, passing it to Chu Lian. This is something that Zixiang asked me to pass to you. Why don't you open it and see what's inside? Chu Lian took the bag and set it on the table. She quickly removed the knot on the bag and saw that there were a few items within. Captain Gua cast a glance at the bag before freezing for a moment. He then shot a look at Wenqing and Wenlan, who were standing behind Chu Lian, and quietly tiptoed out of the tent. Inside the bag was the sugarcane that Hechangdi hadn't been able to give Chu Lian, as well as a thick stack of letters. Chu Lian knelt down by the table and moved aside the sugarcane, pressing down the letter. The letter at the top had been written today. On the envelope were the words, "To my dear wife, Chu Lian," as well as the date. Chu Lian picked up the envelope and stared at it blankly before tearing it open. There was only a single sheet of paper inside. The letter had been written in a bold hand with regular, even strokes. It wasn't very long either, but Chu Lian read every single word earnestly. Although she could have read the contents in a few seconds, Chu Lian read it for 7 whole minutes. After finishing the letter, she carefully folded up the paper and placed it back into the envelope before taking up the next letter. From dusk till nightfall, Chu Lian continued reading until she had finished the very last letter. This letter seemed especially big and there wasn't anything written on the envelope. However, the sides already seemed worn. It was clear that Sanlang had taken it out regularly from time to time to have made it so seasoned. Chu Lian carefully opened it. When she saw what was inside, her almond-shaped eyes widened instantly. These were the letters she had written to Hechangdi. No, wait, these couldn't be considered letters. She had been afraid of exposing her origins through her handwriting, so she had sent drawings to Hechangdi. Chu Lian pulled out the sheaf of drawings within, but found that the edges seemed to be slightly charred. Her brows drew together in confusion. In the end, she slid the papers back into the envelope with care. She looked at the table covered in letters and a strange feeling rose within her heart. These letters had been arranged according to the dates they had been written. The one on top was the most recent one that Sanlang had written, while the one at the bottom was the stack of drawings she had first sent him. He had started with a letter a month, before increasing it to 2. By the time it was November, Hechangdi was already writing a letter every 3 days. The address on the letter was always, "To my dear wife, Chu Lian." The roads had been sealed by the snowstorm in November, so letters hadn't been sent out in a long time. They had just accumulated here. However, he hadn't stopped writing letters. Some of them were just a few simple sentences and some of them talked about things that had happened in the camp. While reading them, Chu Lian could imagine how Sanlang must have sprawled on the desk with furrowed brows in the middle of the night while writing these letters. In today's letter, he had informed her that he would have to leave the camp for a period of time. The details of this mission were a military secret, so he couldn't tell her anything else. However, given how she had sent the snowboat to the camp the other day, she was instantly able to guess what Hechangdi had gone out to do. He had most likely gone to Sioux City by Lake Qianshan to gather grain using the snowboat. Hechangdi's letter had specially told her to stay in the northern border camp. Since he wasn't in Liangzhou anymore and he had taken Mo Qinggui and the other soldiers with him, it wasn't safe for her to return to the He estate now. He had already reported this situation to Great General Qian and had gotten permission for Chu Lian to stay in the female camp until he returned. As for the mountain flower on Mount Aoming, the snow mountain mists, he had already sent someone to investigate it, so she didn't have to worry about it. Chu Lian suddenly realized that Sanlang was pretty reliable when he wasn't having one of his fits of lunacy. She took a deep breath and put away the letters, returning them to the bag neatly. Following that, she told Wenlan to bring the sugarcane back with them. Once she was done, Chu Lian finally left He Changdi's tent and returned to Sima Hu's female camp. After General Qian had entrusted He Changdi with this great responsibility, he had brought his trusted subordinates and his sworn brothers from the right-wing army out of the camp. Together with the snowboat, they were headed to the nearest city from Liangzhou, Su City. In the dark of the night, despite the falling snow and howling winds, his heart was on fire. The tragedy of the northern border troops wouldn't be repeated again. Not only that, they might even get a chance to defeat the Tuhuns. If they could somehow survive this winter and store up enough grain, the Tuhuns would no longer be a threat to the northern border. He Changdi's heart burned with passion. When his thoughts turned to Chu Lian, who was waiting for him back in camp, confidence and urgency filled up his heart. High up on the city walls of Su City, the night was brightened by the light of torches and braziers. Elite soldiers stood guard on the city walls, giving the ancient lakeside city a menacing air. A tall and slender man stood at the highest point of the city's gate tower, facing the harsh winter winds. The man was wearing a dark-colored court outfit lined with leopard fur at the collar. His cloak flapped crazily in the wind. He wore a jade crown high on his head. The flickering torch lights were to his back, so his features were shrouded in darkness. He suddenly burst out into a fit of coughing, causing the man behind him to ask with concern, "Master, why don't we head back? The wind is too strong here. You haven't been well these 2 days." Chapter 382, Clashing Head-On. 1. Xiao Bojian gazed out at the dark expanse of Lake Qianshan, his eyes clouded over with thought. "Have you gotten any news?" Due to his cold, his voice came out a little hoarse. One had no other choice but to accompany his master on this gate tower, suffering the lashing of the winter winds. "Master, I just got the news that honored Lady Jeannie is perfectly safe. She was only hurt on her ankle. It took some time for the news to travel here, so she has most likely recovered by now. She should be in Liangzhou City now." Xiao Bojian's cold and sinister features finally softened a little. However, his expression remained grim. Although he had a beautiful face, that expression would strike fear into anyone. "Pass down my order. No matter what situation the northern border troops are in, Lianer must be kept safe." One carried a troubled expression and his lips parted to speak. However, in the end, he swallowed his objection and replied with, "Yes, master." Xiao Bojian covered his coughing with one hand while reaching into the pouch he carried on his waist with the other. He groped around inside the pouch before pulling out the fine lucky jade amulet that Chu Lian had gifted to him. The lucky jade amulet shone with a warm glow under the light of the torches around him. It was clear that it was regularly held in a person's hand and worn. Xiao Bojian's lips stretched into a sinister smile. He Changdi had better watch out. Chu Lian was going to be his someday. Anyone who wanted to take his woman would have to do it over his dead body. At this point of time, neither of the two adversaries knew that they would soon face each other in the ancient Su City. When dawn finally broke, the soldiers standing on the city walls spotted a group of men and horses traveling over the frozen Lake Qianshan. All of them were extremely alarmed and quickly sent out scouts to investigate the situation while reporting everything to their superiors. Half a day later, He Changdi and his group were invited into the camp of the reinforcement army, who had set up base within Su City. The reinforcement army consisted of the Northwest Army and 20,000 soldiers from the Hunan Army. The commander of this army was the great general of the Northwest Army, Yuan Zhong. He had originally been one of Great General Qian's subordinates. If He Changdi were to use this connection to request for aid, the result would likely be favorable for the northern border troops. He Sanlang had arrived at the Sioux city camp right in the middle of mealtime. The subordinates who had joined He Sanlang on this mission noticed that the Northwest Army even had rice to eat, and their eyes nearly popped out of their sockets in envy as their mouths filled with drool. Although they envied the Northwest Army, the border troops were still happy. Since the Northwest Army was eating rice, that meant that the Northwest Army didn't lack for supplies. Their request should go along much smoother then. One of the officers of the Northwest Army led He Changdi and his party to a tent. This tent was clearly much more luxurious than the others, so it was most likely the commander's tent. He Changdi, Xiao Hongyu, and Zhang Mai waited outside the tent. It had been a harsh 6-day journey to reach Sioux City using the snowboat. All of them looked quite haggard right now. Even Zhang Mai, who was usually more concerned with keeping up his neat appearance, sported some messy stubble. There were even some ash marks on his face here and there. His hands and feet were covered in chilblains from exposure to the elements. After 15 minutes, He Changdi and his party were ushered into the tent. Yuan Zhong and a few officers of the Northwest Army welcomed He Sanlang and the rest. Once He Changdi entered the tent, he followed protocol and bowed in greeting to the great general of the Northwest Army, Yuan Zhong. When Yuan Zhong saw that the 3 men had all knelt down on one knee while keeping their backs straight, he hesitated before bursting out into laughter. He stepped forward and personally helped the 3 men up. I didn't expect Great General Qian to have sent such young officers out here. The younger generation is truly to be reckoned with. Xiao Bojian was seated beside Yuan Zhong. His gaze abruptly sharpened as he noticed the young man who was the leader of the party. His grip tightened around the teacup he was holding in one hand. He Changdi. He had come here. So it was true that enemies were always destined to meet. He Changdi's senses were finely honed, so he immediately realized that there was a cold gaze leveled on him. He shifted his eyes upwards and caught sight of Xiao Bojian seated above him, his thin lips pressed together in response. In an instant, the originally amiable atmosphere in the tent turned so tense that there should have been sparks flying in the air. Yuan Zhong was the first to notice that the atmosphere didn't seem right. He glanced at the 2 men strangely. Do you know each other? The 2 men replied at the same time with similar cold tones, not at all. Yuan Zhong had no choice but to cough awkwardly. In a quick turn of wit, he swallowed the question, then is there a grudge between you 2? He had been about to bring up. If He Sanlang were to give an answer to that unsaid question, he would surely have said, the grudge of stealing my wife and ruining my family. Thus, the discussion within the tent continued with the strange atmosphere in the air. Yuan Zhong made sleeping arrangements for He Changdi's group. As for the supplies, they were in charge of gathering them themselves. The general also kept He Changdi and his party behind for a meal. After the meal, perhaps due to some inner sadist tendencies, he actually ordered Xiao Bojian to escort He Changdi out of the commander's tent. Chapter 383, Clashing Head-On, 2. When they left the tent, the faces of the 2 men who absolutely hated each other were icier than the frozen lake beyond the city walls. Xiao Bojian announced coldly, goodbye. He Changdi had not even an iota of interest in talking to him, so he was about to turn around and leave when his eyes swept over Xiao Bojian's body. A single item immediately caught his attention. There was a pure white piece of jade hanging from Xiao Bojian's waistband. He Changdi couldn't be more familiar with the carvings on that jade. That was the lucky jade amulet that grandmother had given Chu Lian on the 2nd day of their marriage at the tea ceremony. His grandfather had worn it often while he had still been alive. Why was that jade amulet hanging off Xiao Bojian's waist? The darkness in He Sanlang's eyes gathered into a thick fog. The hands resting at his sides clenched into fists, and his knuckles creaked as if he might break his own fingers. However, a thread of reason still remained within him, keeping him from losing control and grabbing Xiao Bojian by the collar to interrogate him. Just that tiny ripple of emotion in He Changdi was enough for Xiao Bojian to sense that something wasn't right. When Xiao Bojian noticed that his expression had turned into one of restraint, he looked at He Changdi with a faint smile. "Oh. Are you perhaps feeling well, He Sanlang? Should I send one of the doctors over to look you over?" As Xiao Bojian spoke, he couldn't help stroking the warm jade at his waist. He Sanlang's expression sunk and he turned and left the commander's tent. Xiao Bojian looked at He Changdi's hastily retreating back and let out a bark of laughter out of the blue. The guard following closely behind him nearly shivered as goosebumps rose all over his body. One knew that it was never a good thing whenever his master laughed. Xiao Bojian turned around and spoke as he played with the jade in his hand. "Let's return to our tent. It seems like things are getting more interesting." All the anger he had felt from Chu Lian leaving for the north so abruptly without a word had been instantly calmed by the sight of He Changdi's expression just now. Xiao Bojian knew exactly why He Changdi had been unhappy. Although he didn't know where this jade amulet had come from, it was likely something precious, judging from the shade of red that He Changdi's face had turned into. Since Lianer had given such a precious jade amulet to him, that clearly meant that he was the one in Lianer's heart. He Sanlang was probably nothing compared to him. On the way back to his tent, Xiao Bojian's exquisite features were contorted into a ruthless expression. 1. Report on the matters that I ordered you to investigate. The mountain paths have been blocked for days and the snow is up to our knees. How did they make it over with a carriage to ask for aid? Ever since Xiao Bojian had earned the top rank in the imperial examinations, one had been ever more careful with his moody and unpredictable master. He replied, He Sanlang didn't use a carriage. He used something called a snowboat. From what this subordinate heard, it can glide over snow and ice and its speed doesn't lose out to that of carriages. What? A flash of alarm flitted across Xiao Bojian's face. How had he never heard of something like that before? That is all this subordinate has been able to find out so far. The snowboat that they brought here is being closely guarded by his men. Even our spies won't be able to get close to it so soon. One added with his head lowered. Continue investigating. Xiao Bojian's voice turned a little hoarse from his displeasure. What kind of weapon was that? He Changdi couldn't have had it from the start, or the northern border troops wouldn't have waited until now. There must be someone helping them from the shadows. Xiao Bojian clenched his fists. His plans had been completely disrupted by He Changdi's arrival. He Changdi and his group were brought to the tent they had been assigned. On the way there, Xiao Hongyu and Zhang Mai could sense that He Changdi's mood wasn't very good. Zhang Mai knew that He Sanlang was a quiet one. Even if he had something weighing on his heart, he would only keep it in and stew on it by himself. He would never talk to someone to help release the burdens he carried within. He patted He Changdi on the shoulder. After being on the road for so long, let's take a hot bath and rest for a bit. No matter what it is, perhaps you'll be able to think through it once you have a good night's sleep. After saying so, he pulled Xiao Hongyu with him and left the tent. Once Zhang Mai and Xiao Hongyu had left, He Changdi could no longer hold back the frustration in his heart. He turned to the table in the tent and flipped it over. He was feeling very conflicted right now. Although he had finally cleared up the feelings in his heart, he had suddenly been dealt a sound slap in the face. What did that wicked woman Chu Lian want? He had started trusting in her, but he had just seen grandfather's jade amulet on Xiao Bojian. He Sanlang felt torn apart by his pain. He didn't know how to face his budding feelings for Chu Lian now. It was impossible for him to ignore what had just happened too. He wanted so badly to fly back to Chu Lian's side right now and ask her about everything once and for all. Thuds sounded in the tent as the table flew to the floor and the tea set that had been on top shattered. The ear-piercing sharp sounds calmed down the raging tsunami within He Changde's heart. He laid down on the bed, completely worn out. His chest rose and fell with his breathing as he covered his eyes with one arm. Snippets of his past and current lives flashed through his mind. The current He Changde was very, very lost. 2 days later, Xiao Bojian finally got news of the snowboat. One handed a tiny metal tube to Xiao Bojian. "Master, this is what our spy in the northern border sent over." Xiao Bojian tapped the trigger on the surface of the tube, causing the tube to spring open, revealing a slender roll of paper within. There was only a single line of words on the note, but that was enough to make Xiao Bojian start trembling with emotion. Lianer. So it was Lianer. He just knew it. How could the bunch of old men in the north have come up with the snowboat? Such an innovative and novel idea could only have come from his brilliant Lianer. Xiao Bojian trembled with excitement. He wanted to be right in front of Chu Lian right now. He wanted to trap her in his embrace and plant a kiss on those petal-like lips of hers. However, before he even finished getting over his excitement, an icy aura started creeping back over his body. He had suddenly realized that Chu Lian hadn't made that marvelous snowboat for him, she had made it for that He Changde. His hands turned into tightly clenched fists. Due to the abrupt change in his emotions, he started coughing intensely. Chapter 384, Deal 1. One spoke up worriedly, "Master, why don't you rest for a moment?" Xiao Bojian refused to acknowledge one's suggestion. He harumphed and continued forming the plan in his mind. By the time He Changde woke up, it was already morning of the next day. Even though Su City was close to Liangzhou City, their climates were completely different. While it was still snowing heavily in Liangzhou, the residents of Su City were able to experience the occasional warm winter morning day. When Xiao Hongyu and Zhang Mai walked out of their tent after a nice long night of rest, they had the feeling of having walked out of a prison and into the sunlight once again. Having gotten used to the bone-piercing cold winds and harsh snow of Liangzhou, the two men felt a little uncomfortable when they were only met with warm and gentle sunshine on their faces. After they moved into He Changde's tent, Xiao Hongyu started joking around. "What's wrong, brother He? Why are you in such a rush to go shopping in Su City? Are you looking to buy some of their specialties for sister-in-law?" Zhang Mai smiled upon hearing Xiao Hongyu's teasing. However, He Changde didn't show any reaction to the joke. Instead, his expression turned even more grave. "Brother Zhang, Hongyu, I have something I have to discuss with you." 2 bright and sunny days passed in Su City before another wave of cold wind and snow came by. The city that had managed to thaw for a little while was once again engulfed by a snowstorm. Right now, there were only a few people in the commander's tent, but the atmosphere was tense. Yuan Zhong was seated at the head of the table with his 2 trusted lieutenants by his side. To his left was the secretary of their current march, Xiao Bojian. To his right was the representative of the northern border troops who had come to request aid, He Changde. Xiao Bojian lifted up one of the teacups set out on the table in front of him, his feminine features set into an expression that spoke trouble for He Changde. "Captain He, I hope that you'll understand the situation that you're in now. The great general just has one small request. If you agree to it, then our rescue army will immediately hand over the supplies once we finish preparing them." He Changde had turned pale with rage. He gripped the edge of the table with one hand so tightly that his veins bulged against his skin. Although he had managed to keep his expression cool and focused, anyone could tell that he was furious. "You're trying to take advantage of us while we're in need." Xiao Bojian was enjoying He Changde's little fit of temper very much. He smiled. This is where you're wrong, Captain He. There's no such thing as a free lunch in this world. We're happy to provide whatever you need, but you should be able to fulfill our teeny tiny little request in return, don't you think? He Sanlang glanced at Yuan Zhong, but the general had his head lowered as he seemingly downed some wine to drown his troubles. He was clearly silently agreeing with Xiao Bojian's actions. He Changdi felt immense disappointment. If Great General Qian were to find out what Yuan Zhong had done today, he would likely be equally, if not even more, disappointed. Captain He, it would be wiser to acquiesce to our request. You might be able to continue waiting, but those 50,000 soldiers in the northern border might not. Xiao Bojian was practically sneering at him. Under these circumstances, he didn't believe that He Changdi would keep the blueprints of the snowboat in exchange for the lives of his comrades. Dejection appeared on He Changdi's face, as if he had finally given in to Xiao Bojian's forceful threat. All right. I'll give you the blueprints for the snowboat. But you have to give me half a day's time. I have to persuade the brothers who accompanied me here. He Changdi shut his eyes. Shame was displayed on his handsome features, along with plenty of helplessness. Seeing such a pained expression on his rival, a wave of satisfaction flooded Xiao Bojian's heart. Good, at least you've managed to think it through, Captain He. I'll have someone escort you back. I hope you won't make us wait too long. He Sanlang left with an air of defeat. However, the moment he was sure that Xiao Bojian could no longer see his face, his gaze sharpened. Once He Changdi was gone from the tent, Yuan Zhong's melancholy and troubled expression faded away and he suddenly lit up with energy. He walked over to Xiao Bojian's side and patted his shoulder, praising him. Your idea worked, Wu Jing. As long as we get those blueprints and make even more of those snowboats, then the achievements of the northern border troops will be ours. Xiao Bojian played along and praised the general as well. After getting complimented, Yuan Zhong felt even better. Zhang Mai and Xiao Hongyu quickly welcomed He Sanlang once he returned to the tent. Brother He, how did it go? He Changdi sat down by the table and shook his head with his brows tightly furrowed. It looks like they won't give in unless we hand over the snowboat. Then did you agree to it? He Sanlang clenched his fists and nodded. I agreed to give them the blueprints before night falls. Xiao Hongyu's eyes widened in shock after hearing that. He spoke in disbelief. Brother He, you actually agreed to it. What if they refuse to give us the supplies after you give them the blueprints? Does this mean that our 50,000 troops can't do anything but wait for death? Zhang Mai hurriedly stopped Xiao Hongyu once he noticed how agitated he was getting. What nonsense are you saying? Would your brother He be so stupid? After he finished scolding Xiao Hongyu, Zhang Mai turned to He Changdi. Zixiang, tell me honestly. Do you have a backup plan? He Changdi looked at the two men with his lips pressed together and a resolute glint in his eyes. There was no hint of the desolation he had shown back in the commander's tent. It's not time yet, so I can't tell you guys. But as long as you trust me, I won't disappoint you. Good. Since you've said so, this old brother will trust you. Zhang Mei's gaze showed the same determination. He didn't forget to pat Xiao Hongyu's shoulder. Brat, did you hear that? Xiao Hongyu took a deep breath, but it was obvious that he still had unvoiced objections. He sat by the bed silently, unlike his normal boisterous self. Zhang Mai shook his head. That's just how he is. Don't mind him. He'll be fine later on. He Changdi and the rest had been living together for a few months. He was even sharing a tent with Xiao Hongyu, so of course he knew the brat's personality well. He really didn't mind it at all. Chapter 385, Deal 2. He Sanlang had foreseen that things wouldn't go smoothly after meeting Xiao Bojian. However, he hadn't expected Xiao Bojian to be eyeing the snowboat. Luckily, he had taken precautions before entering the Northwestern Army's camp. Otherwise, they would really have had no other choice. He had already dragged out the discussions for 2 days. If he didn't pretend to give in to their demands today, Yuan Zhong would likely have tried to take the snowboat by force instead. The Northwestern Army hadn't seen any action for a long time. Right now, the Great Wu dynasty was slowly progressing into a golden age, so there wasn't as much need for the military as compared to when the dynasty had been founded. The Northwestern Army was facing imminent disarmament. The Yuan family had gotten into power due to their control over the Northwestern Army. Once the Northwestern Army was disbanded, the Yuan family would fall into decline. This wasn't just Yuan Zhong alone who was struggling, but the entire noble house of the Yuan family. After years without any notable achievements, the Northwestern Army would likely be destroyed if things continued this way. So what did they need the most right now? Outstanding military achievements. If they managed to claim the feat of defeating the Tuhans for themselves, then even the emperor would have to think twice and wait a few more years before cutting away the Northwestern Army. Xiao Bojian had most likely used this angle to form an alliance with the Northwestern Army. This man was just as formidable as he had been in his past life. The depths of Yichang's narrow eyes darkened. However, he was no longer the naive and trusting He Sanlang from his past life. Xiao Bojian was having a rare break within his tent at this moment. He held a letter in his hand. Gripped in his beautiful hand were 2 pieces of paper. His eyes flickered as he read quickly. The letter had been sent by Duke Ying. It was just a normal letter asking after his well-being, but at the end of the letter, the Duke had mentioned his marriage. Xiao Bojian wasn't considered young any longer at his age. The Duke hadn't mentioned marriage at all to him previously because his identity was lowly. However, now that he had managed to become the top scholar of the imperial examinations and with Duke Ying's help, he was now a trusted official at court. Duke Ying had mentioned offhandedly in the letter that he wanted to marry 5th Miss Su to him. Since they were already teacher and student, if Xiao Bojian became his son-in-law, it would only boost the relations between them. The old Duke's tone made it seem like the matter was already decided and that there was no need for further discussion. An ominous glint shone in Xiao Bojian's eyes before he snorted and threw the letter into the brazier next to him. A tongue of flame slipped through the wire mesh on top of the brazier and consumed the 2 thin pieces of paper in an instant. Xiao Bojian's heart was filled with contempt. That stupid old man. He was only looking to bind him down with ties of marriage in order to use him to strengthen his position in court. Did that old fart think that he, Xiao Bojian, would still let him do as he wished after finally becoming successful? Furthermore, he was trying to marry Chu Su to him. A third-rate noble miss wasn't fit to become his wife. Back then, Duke Ying had been one of those facilitating Chu Lian's engagement to the He family. As his teacher, how could Duke Ying not have known that he and Chu Lian were in love? He had even hinted so to his teacher. However, in comparison to the chance of making a connection to the influential House Jinggan, Duke Ying hadn't even considered his feelings and had sent Chu Lian off to be married to He Sanlang without any hesitation. Other than Chu Lian, he would marry any daughter of the Chu family in this lifetime. Back in the capital far away, the city was bustling with liveliness and joy. It was almost time to celebrate the new year again. The streets were filled with citizens buying Chinese New Year goods. In the Ying estate, it was more livelier than it had been in previous years, since the top scholar had been produced from their estate. The top scholar was the famous Xiao Wujing from the Imperial College and old Duke Ying's prized pupil. Although he wasn't really part of the Chu family, a disciple was still considered half a son. Thus, the sombering estate had become especially boisterous. Even the servants who went out to purchase goods all had their chins lifted high in the air, as if the feat of Mr. Xiao had elevated their status somehow. Within the inner court of the Ying estate, the junior members of the family were greeting the patriarch and matriarch. Old Duchess Ing felt frustrated upon looking down at all of her granddaughters. Her sons had been working hard with their concubines. There would likely be a few more young misses coming out in the new year. The youngest of her grandchildren now was little Chong, who had just made it through her first month. She was a child born from one of Chu Lian's father's concubines and was now the 15th young miss in her generation. Old Duchess Ing glanced at her with disdain, grumbling in her heart, just another burden to feed. The concubines of the Ing estate were producing children non-stop. It seemed like they had become even more fertile ever since Xiao Bojian had become the top scholar. However, there weren't many legitimate sons or daughters being birthed. When she thought about it, the legitimate wives of the main, second and third branches were already getting old. They were already past childbearing age. Even if they were still fertile, their husbands had most likely lost interest in them in favor of younger and prettier things. The number of concubines in the estate had been increasing of late. The Ing estate had never lacked for children, so the old duchess was even more blasé about these concubine-born grandchildren of hers. Old Duchess Ing looked at the grandchildren gathered before her once before waving her hands impatiently, ordering the concubines to dismiss themselves, along with their children. The only ones left behind were the legitimate wives of each of the branches and the few legitimate children of the estate. Chapter 386, Contingency Plan 1. The hall that had been full to the point of bursting emptied out in an instant. Miss Sue stood on the right side of the hall with her mother and aunts. She had her head and eyes lowered, the very picture of a virtuous and humble woman. Old Duchess Ing cast a measuring gaze over her before she was satisfied. She beckoned to Miss Sue, come over to grandmother. Miss Sue shot a quick glance at her mother before hurrying over to the old duchess. The old duchess patted her head with affection. Our Miss Sue has already grown into a young lady in the blink of an eye. Look at how lovely these cheeks are. Grandmother still remembers when you were just a tiny little infant in your mother's arms. These caring words were very generic and had been used hundreds of times over. Back when it had been time for second miss to be betrothed, the old duchess had said the exact same words. The same had gone for fourth Mississippi. Now that she was saying them to fifth Miss Sue, everyone pricked up their ears. As much as Miss Sue didn't like this grandmother of hers, she still showed her respect. Granddaughter thanks grandmother for her concern. My good granddaughter. Old Duchess Ing spoke with so much feeling that it almost seemed like her eyes were about to tear up. If not for the unspoken understanding in the family that the matriarch didn't like girls, they might even have been moved by this show of grandmotherly love. One of the maidservants handed the old duchess a handkerchief just in time, and the old duchess dabbed at the corners of her eyes. Since you're already a grown lady, grandmother can't keep you any longer. I've been in discussion with your grandfather these few days and we've chosen a good husband for you. You and your mother should be familiar with the man in question, he's our estate's top scholar. When Miss Sue heard this, her body trembled in shock. She lost control of her emotions and was about to reject it on the spot. However, before she could say anything, her mother tugged at her. The madam of the main branch chuckled and said, "That really is a good marriage partner for our Miss Sue. You've worked hard, mother." There were all sorts of expressions on display in the hall right now, making for a marvelous show. Miss Yuan was standing next to her own mother. When she heard the news, her eyes immediately widened. She looked as if she was in disbelief. Mr. Xiao had such extraordinary looks and he was the top scholar to boot. How could he possibly marry Miss Sue? After the imperial examinations, Xiao Bojian had visited the Ing estate often. Due to his newly earned status, he came and went from the estate freely. Housing was falling over themselves and trying their best to treat him as one of their own, as if that would somehow make him one of their descendants. He had already created a reputation for himself in the Imperial College even before he had attended the Imperial examinations. Later on, when he had become the top scholar, he had become even more popular as a target of admiration for most of the men and women in the capital. Miss Yuan hadn't seen him much previously. Now that Xiao Bojian was regularly coming and going from the Ying estate, Miss Yuan had found a chance to sneak a peek at him. From just that one peek, her heart had fallen for him. She wasn't a young child any longer. She would turn 15 and become of marriageable age in the new year. Xiao Bojian had a bright future ahead of him. How could she do nothing upon hearing that grandmother wanted to betroth Miss Su to him? The moment she got back to the second branch, Miss Yuan hugged her mother's leg and started complaining. Second madam only had this one precious daughter, so she naturally thought of Miss Yuan first in all things. She had a pretty good impression of Xiao Bojian as well, so her heart softened when her daughter pleaded with her. When Miss Yuan saw that she had a chance, she continued hugging her mother and playing up to her, asking her mother to persuade grandmother to let her marry Xiao Bojian instead. Things weren't set yet and only their family knew about it so far. Hadn't Chu Lian been sent to House Jingan because Miss Su had fallen sick that time? If grandmother couldn't be convinced, then couldn't she just have Miss Su fall sick again? Back in Liangzhou and Sioux City, worries over the war had dampened the festive spirits of the residents. He Changdi stood before his tent and looked up at the gray sky. It was already dusk. Night would be falling soon. Time was trickling slowly, second by second, towards Xiao Bojian's deadline. He turned to the direction of the commander's tent, only to see Xiao Bojian slowly walking towards him with that same guard next to him. Suddenly, Samlang's slightly slanted eyes narrowed as his frozen features broke out into a faint smile. Xiao Bojian hadn't even taken more than 2 steps when a soldier came running from behind and requested his presence. His leisurely and relaxed expression flipped into a gloomy one and he seemed to have turned into a monster who seemed ready to swallow humans alive. "What did you say?" "The Min family army is here." The soldier shrunk into himself and nodded, not daring to say anything at all. Xiao Bojian ground his teeth hard. He shot a cold glare towards He Changdi's tent and just so happened to catch the sight of He Changdi standing in front of his tent with his back straight and hands behind his back. Although there was still a distance between them, their gazes seemed to clash in midair with imaginary sparks. It was as if a thunderclap had split the cloudy skies. The Min army guarded the border running along the Min River and there were 30,000 soldiers serving in it. The commander of the Min army was an old comrade of Count Jingan. At the same time, he was also a subordinate of Prince Jin. Zhang Mai and Xiao Hongyu had gotten the news as well. They rushed out from the tent and bumped fists with He Changdi. Zhang Mai lamented, "Zixiang, if you hadn't taken precautions and sent Leader Mo's group away when we entered the city, the Min army wouldn't have been able to rush here in time." In his previous life, He Changdi had experienced the fickle nature of humans, as well betrayal from those he once trusted. How could he remain the same naive fool as before? Of course he had kept a contingency plan when it came to something as important as the lives of his comrades. Within an hour, He Changdi and his party had been invited to the commander's tent. Chapter 387, Contingency Plan, 2. Great General Min was seated at the same level as Yuan Zhong. There were only about 30,000 men in the Northwestern Army. With the Hunan troops added into this temporary army, they only numbered 50,000. Although the Min army only had about 30,000 men, their weapons and equipment were of much better quality than those of the Northwestern Army. If they were to face off in a battle, the Northwestern Army would not be a match for the Min army. Furthermore, there were 20,000 Hunan troops mixed in with the Northwestern Army right now. If it really came down to a fight, the Hunan troops might take advantage of the confusion for their own benefit. Yuan Zhong hadn't climbed up to this position by being stupid. He could only lament that He Changdi had been too thorough and careful in his actions. He and Xiao Bojian had been too careless. Now that the Min army had arrived, they had lost their best chance to strike. Those snowboat blueprints were now out of their grasp. With the Min army supporting Heartwarming, the Northwestern Army handed over the grains they had stored in Sioux City the very next day. Great General Min personally escorted Heartwarming's group out to Lake Qianshan. Although the Min army had rushed over to Sioux City in just 2 short days, they hadn't been given actual military orders, so they couldn't stay in Sioux City for too long, despite being under Prince Jin's orders. Thus, on the 3rd day after Heartwarming's grain supply group had left, the Min army also made their way back to the Min River area. Xiao Bojian stayed in his tent with an overcast expression. Yuan Zhong's trust in him had lessened since his plan had failed. These few days, Yuan Zhong seemed to be avoiding him on purpose, leaving him furious. One silently stood behind Xiao Bojian and pretended not to exist. It was only when Xiao Bojian called out to him that he made a sound of acknowledgement and walked over to his master's side. "Your orders, master." After a slight pause, Xiao Bojian's face contorted into an extremely fierce expression. "Send the information I wrote yesterday to Liangzhou, as soon as possible." Without a shred of hesitation, one answered affirmatively and dashed out to execute his orders. Xiao Bojian toyed with the jade amulet attached to his waist. Once he thought of the fact that Heartwarming's efforts to bring provisions to Liangzhou might simply become fuel for someone else's achievements, he wondered how Heartwarming would feel, and whether he would fall apart. Although the skies over Sioux City had cleared up for 2 days, Liangzhou was still experiencing heavy winds and snow. As of now, the snow was already knee-deep and it was difficult even for horses to pass through. Chu Lian stayed in the female camp with her maidservants and passed her days in relaxation. 10 days had passed since Heartwarming left, and she couldn't help but start to worry about him. Going by normal speeds, even if he went to Sioux City to borrow provisions, he should have been back in 10 days. Even if he got delayed along the way, it would take another 2 days at the most. However, other than the endless wind and snow blowing over the plains, there was no other news from the border army camp. Chu Lian could guess that the state of the army supplies was close to critical. Over the next 2 days, there were cases of soldiers from both the left-wing and right-wing armies fainting while on guard duty due to hunger. However, even so, the army cook still didn't give the hungry soldiers even a single bowl more of bean porridge. At this stage, even the female camp was down to eating bean porridge, and the bean porridge was also getting even more dilute. Chu Lian glanced at the steaming hot bowl of rice porridge in front of her. Due to her worry for Heartwarming, her appetite had been very poor over the past few days, so she had only eaten a few mouthfuls of it. Chu Lian waved her hand, "Take this away, and give it to the guards outside." At this point of time, the most popular job in the female camp was guarding Chu Lian's tent. Those who guarded her tent would often receive rewards from the honored lady, such as a piping hot bowl of congee, or a few delicious pieces of pastry, or several slices of jerky. Chu Lian had already moved out of Sima Hu's tent and was now staying in a tent right opposite Sima Hu's. She had heard from Captain Gua that this was something that Heartwarming had specially arranged for. There was a limit to the supplies Chu Lian had brought, so she couldn't possibly donate them all to the border army. Besides, there wasn't even enough to give each soldier a single grain of rice. The most she could do was to provide a little aid to a female soldier or two. Chu Lian's popularity in the female camp was outstanding, and she was only second to Sima Hui at this point. Today, after having lunch with Wenqing and Wenlan, she laid on her bed and flipped through a book of folk stories. The guards outside announced that their general had come. Once they finished speaking, the tent flap was lifted and Sima Hui strode in, dressed in full armor. Upon seeing Sima Hu's grave expression, Chu Lian quickly sat upright. "Where are you going, Sister Hui?" Sima Hui was dressed in full battle armor and was even wearing a silver helmet on her head. Her red-tasseled spear hung on her back while she kept one hand on the sword hung at her waist. She walked up to Chu Lian's side and fixed her gaze on the young lady. Her tone was dead serious as she spoke. The two Huns have suddenly gathered up their men and seem to be on the verge of mounting a large-scale attack. Lianer, I've been ordered to lead my troops out to the front lines immediately. Chu Lian was completely stunned by her words. She didn't understand why the two Huns would be trying to mount an attack at this time. It was the middle of the coldest period of the whole year in Liangzhou, when the winds and snow were still blowing strongly. It was far from the right time to attack for the two Huns. Had something gone wrong along the way? After a brief period of dazed silence, Chu Lian finally reacted, Sister Hui, the battle at the front lines is more important, please don't worry about me. Sima Hui gripped the hilt of the sword in her hands and nodded, Lianer, you'll leave some soldiers behind to protect you. Stay safe here. TL note, the Min River is an actual river in China, in the Fujian province. The Min army isn't actually named after the river, but after Great General Min's family name. This usually means that the Min family controls or funds the army, which may be why they have better equipment as compared to the Northwestern Army, which is funded by a government trying to cut military spending. The author specifically uses the term phubbing to refer to the soldiers in the Min army, which can translate to citizen militia. This might imply that the soldiers in the Min army are actually farmers conscripted into service as reserve soldiers, but we have to wait and see if the author mentions more of this system later in the story. I can't remember, oops. On a side note, the He estate in the capital and the He estate in Liangzhou city actually use different characters in Chinese too. 3. Chapter 388, Captured. 1. Chu Lian quickly agreed to Sima Hu's request and told her to hurry quickly to the front lines. It wouldn't be good if she wasted too much time here. The originally quiet camp was now in complete chaos. Bugle horns sounded loudly, one after another. Everyone started preparing for battle. The sounds of hoofbeats and the soldiers' bugle calls blended into a mess of noise. Even though Chu Lian was staying put in her tent, she could still feel the tension in the air outside. Wenqing and Wenlan had similar expressions of anxiety. Third young madam, what should we do? Wenlan asked with a frown. Chu Lian's almond-shaped eyes were fixed on the tent flap, which had lifted a little from the winds outside. Well, stay in this camp. They're still preparing for battle out on the front lines. There's nowhere safer in the whole of Liangzhou city than the back of the main camp now. Furthermore, General Sima Hui left some soldiers behind to guard us. Wenqing nodded upon hearing this. The two maidservants could only try their best to keep their anxiety under control for now. However, just in case, Wenqing went out to call the Li siblings over. The few of them discussed how they should guard Chu Lian's tent. Chu Lian no longer had the mood to continue reading her book. The two Huns had clearly chosen to stall and wait out the winter, and it had seemed like there would still be another month before they would take any action. They were hidden in the snowy mountains and they had enough provisions. Furthermore, the two Huns' bodies were much hardier and more resistant to the cold, unlike those of the people of the Great Wu dynasty. Why had they chosen to mount an attack so suddenly? Chu Lian's eyes narrowed. She thought of the current situation that the border troops were in. There was only one possibility for this situation. There was an informant in their ranks. The only ones who knew about the snowboat were Great General Qian's trusted subordinates. Even Sima Hui hadn't known what He Changdi had been sent out to do. Then the only suspects were General Qian's most trusted officers. Shivers went down Chu Lian's back when her thoughts led up to that conclusion. The border troops were already in a dangerous situation, but now there were informants amongst them. If Great General Qian failed to handle this situation properly, then the army would probably fall apart even before He Changdi returned with the supplies. When Wenqing noticed that Chu Lian's face had been drained of all color, she suffered a fright. Third young madam, what happened to you? Chu Lian waved her hand. It's nothing, I'll be fine after a short rest. After more careful thought, she felt that she couldn't stand by without doing anything. She ordered Wenqing to fetch her brush and ink. She was going to write a letter. 15 minutes later, the letter was done. Chu Lian quickly sealed it in an envelope and summoned Li Xing, who had been guarding the tent outside. She told him to take a snowboat and head straight to Sioux City immediately. He was to send the letter directly to Hechangdi, as soon as possible. Although Li Xing didn't know what was contained inside the letter, he didn't dare to tarry even a moment longer. His mission was to obey Chu Lian's orders, so no matter how strange the order, he wouldn't have any complaints. When it came to dusk, more than half of the soldiers in the border camp were gone. The cold winds played with the flags hoisted up in the camp, making them flutter and snap. Even in Sima Hu's female barracks, only a single group of soldiers was left behind to look after the camp. As the final trace of sunlight disappeared over the horizon, light snow started falling from the skies, covering the tents. Chu Lian didn't know what was wrong with her today. There was an uneasy feeling burdening her heart. Although it was already dark outside, she didn't feel any hint of sleepiness at all. Not only that, she had started to order Wenqing and Wenlan to pack things up, as if that would help her forget her worries. Wenqing and Wenlan knew that their mistress was feeling uneasy, so they didn't complain. They followed her orders obediently. They had already prepared themselves. If the border troops failed to defend the border, they would take third young madam with them and escape. If the time came, they would need to have all of their supplies ready. Getting ordered to pack things up at this time was in line with their plans. Suddenly, there was a burst of noise from outside the camp. The three ladies strained their ears to listen, and they heard a female voice speaking, "Honored lady, this subordinate has something to report." Chu Lian let out a sigh of relief. She recognized that voice. It was one of the female soldiers who usually guarded her tent. "Enter." The tent flap was lifted and the female soldier entered the tent. The inside of the tent was illuminated with faint lamplight, making their surroundings rather dim. The female soldier's head was lowered and her features were hidden by shadows. She panted as she spoke urgently, "Honored lady, this subordinate just received news that Manager Qin's tent has been attacked." Chu Lian's expression immediately changed. Manager Qin had been attacked. That was where they were storing all of their supplies. In her worry, she didn't think further and ordered, "Wenqing, take Li Yu with you and go over there immediately." Wenqing sounded off her acknowledgement. She picked up a weapon and her cloak before quickly following the female soldier out. Chu Lian stared at the fluttering tent flap in a daze. Suddenly, her whole body stiffened. Her mind replayed the moment that the female soldier had turned to leave the tent. No wonder she had felt that something wasn't right. Her shoes. That female soldier had been wearing leather boots with flexible soles. Due to the harsh climate of the north and their duties on the battlefield, the female soldiers wore out their boots very quickly. For Great General Qian's soldiers, as well as Sima Hu's female soldiers, all of them wore warm boots with thick soles. The front of the boots was even covered with steel, so that they could damage their enemies on the battlefield even more. Although those thick boots were durable and very practical, they were heavier than the normal type of boots. Furthermore, they were covered in steel at the front, so all the soldiers made light thunks as they walked. As for the female soldier who had just come in, her feet hadn't made any sound on the ground and she had been wearing light boots more suited for trekking. Chu Lian grabbed hold of Wenlan's hand with a grave expression. "Wenlan, we've been tricked. Hurry, pack up our things, we have to escape right now." Chapter 389, Captured, 2. Wenlan couldn't hide her astonishment at Chu Lian's sudden order. However, she trusted third young madam from the bottom of her heart. Luckily, they had already been in the middle of packing up their things. She shoved all the necessities into Chu Lian's arms and told her to hold on tight to them. Next, she wrapped Chu Lian into a fur coat and gave her a small dagger. Wenlan took up her own backpack and a sword before pulling Chu Lian out of the tent. However, before the two of them could make it out, 3 people entered the tent. The newcomers were dressed in the armor of the northern border troops. A tall collar hid half of his face, so they could only hear a slightly raspy voice say, "Honored lady, why don't you come with us?" Wenqing and Li Yu quickly arrived in front of Manager Qin's tent with more than 10 guards following behind. However, Manager Qin's tent was still lit up from within. 2 guards were standing outside looking a little tired, but alert. The 2 ladies exchanged glances as their hearts thumped in unison. Li Yu's brows furrowed together. "Miss Wenqing, take 2 men and stay here to look after Manager Qin. It'll bring the rest of the guards back. I'm afraid we've fallen for their diversion." The female bodyguard gripped her sword in one hand and quickly left. Wenqing turned around to look for the female soldier who had brought them here, but that soldier was already long gone. She stomped the ground in frustration and quickly walked up to the tent. At this time, Manager Qin seemed to have heard the commotion outside. He lifted the tent flap with his clothes draped loosely over his body. When he saw Wenqing standing in front of him with fury and regret written all over her face, he asked curiously, "What did you come here for this late at night? Shouldn't you be guarding 3rd young madam?" Wenqing explained everything to Manager Qin. The chubby man's face turned grave and he quickly followed Wenqing back to Chu Lian's tent without even bothering to put on his clothes properly. By the time they reached the tent, the sight of a dark tent and 4 fallen female soldiers met their eyes. Li Yu bit her lip hard, filled with regrets. "Honored lady has been captured." Wenlan was unconscious on the ground inside the tent. Although she was still gripping her sword tightly in her hand, there was no sign of a struggle anywhere. Even the snacks that Chu Lian hadn't finished were still sitting on the table untouched. Li Yu splashed Wenlan's face with cold water to wake her up. Wenlan regained consciousness, only to find herself surrounded by their party's guards. It took her a dazed moment before she came back to life and shouted, "Hurry! Quick, chase after 3rd young madam. She was taken away by some people. Hurry!" Wenqing wrapped Wenlan up in her arms until Wenlan finally calmed down. "Wenlan, calm down. Think back to just now. What happened exactly? Who took 3rd young madam away?" Wenlan was now relatively calm. She replied with unshed tears in her eyes, "Those kidnappers covered up their faces, so I couldn't tell who they were." She wiped at her tears before continuing, "They said to let 3rd young madam go with them. One of them unsheathed his sword and was about to fight me, that sword had blood on it still. 3rd young madam told them that she would go with them peacefully if they let me go, but how could I just let them take 3rd young madam away without a fight? I took out my sword and I was going to hold them off so 3rd young madam could escape, but I felt something hit the back of my head the moment I took a step forward. I just fainted immediately." Wenqing, Li Yu and Manager Qin understood that it was Chu Lian who had purposely knocked Wenlan out. Although the kidnappers were only targeting 3rd young madam, they were likely looking to kill all witnesses. Wenlan wasn't a match for 3 people alone. Chu Lian had knocked her out purely to save Wenlan's life. "What should we do now?" Li Yu asked. Manager Qin thought for a bit before speaking up, "Take some men with you and search around the camp first. They can't possibly have left without a trace. There should be some hints left behind somewhere, or they might even be hiding in the camp still. I'm going to look for Sir Tang to see if he can help us." Most of the border troops had gone off to the front lines. Even General Qian and Captain Guo weren't in the camp right now. The only person they could go to for help was Sir Tang. After getting jolted around, Chu Lian finally woke up painfully from unconsciousness with a subconscious cry. When she opened her eyes, all she could see was the moving legs of a horse. She tried to move her body, but was immediately held down forcefully by someone. It was only then that she realized she was currently on horseback. She had been tied down on a horse horizontally like she was a sack of rice. No wonder she was about to puke from all this shaking. The rider seemed to know that she had woken up. The first time she fired off was a cold threat: if honored lady would like to avoid suffering, it would be best to cooperate with us. Chu Lian frowned. That was a woman's voice. Furthermore, it was the same woman who had lured Wenqing and Li Yu away. Back in the tent, these people had called her honored lady. It was clear that they knew of her identity. However, along the way to an unknown destination, other than knocking her out, they hadn't done anything else to her. She could feel that she had been covered with a warm fur coat. These people weren't out to kill her. After determining this, Chu Lian quickly calmed down. Her thoughts turned crystal clear. She coughed to get the attention of the rider before asking, "Could you let me sit up straight? I'm really uncomfortable right now." Chapter 390, Quick-Witted. 1. The woman hesitated for a while, as if considering whether there was a trick in Chu Lian's suggestion. Chu Lian used the most childish and demanding voice she could muster. "I don't know martial arts and you have 4 people on your side. I'm trapped on this horse, so how could I possibly run away?" The woman seemed to think that Chu Lian's words made sense. She spoke in a low voice, "Then hold on tight to me." She reached out with her right arm and lifted Chu Lian up so that she could sit upright on the horse's back. Chu Lian was still trapped because she was seated in front of the woman on the horse and the woman's arms acted as a cage around her. Although she felt uneasy, it was much more comfortable than lying horizontally on the horse. The party of 5, including Chu Lian, traveled at a brisk pace for almost an hour. During this hour, no matter what Chu Lian asked, no one answered her. In the end, Chu Lian gave up. It was clear that this group of people had undergone special training. They might even be some special agents trained to kill themselves before revealing their backers. The skies turned darker and the wind started up again, throwing snow in their faces. It was as if the snowstorm had engulfed them. No matter where she looked, she couldn't see anything around her other than the weak glow from the lanterns they carried. Chu Lian didn't understand how these people were navigating when she couldn't even see anything than snow and darkness. Just as Chu Lian's face was about to turn numb from the cold, the party finally stopped. Chu Lian trembled as she rubbed her hands together for warmth, trying to bring some heat back into her frozen appendages. The woman she was riding with helped her off the horse and towards a small hill. The 4 horses were gathered up by one of the men and led on a rope. Chu Lian pulled her fox fur cloak tightly around her body and hobbled through the knee-deep snow. It was only when she got closer that there was a hollow carved into the hillside and that there were people in there. Thanks to the snow covering everything and the darkness of the night, the visibility here was extremely low. If she looked up from the bottom of the hill, she wouldn't be able to see the hollow at the middle of the hill. It was only visible from a close distance. Halfway up the hill, there was a natural hollow that spread inside the hill. The slope of the hill acted like a roof that blocked the wind. In the cold winter, this was the perfect location to make a small base. Once Chu Lian reached the hollow, she could see 2 tents set up. The areas outside the entrances of the tents had been cleared of snow. Even though it was already late, there was still a barbarian woman with her hair tied up in braids busying herself outside the tent. She was trying to cook something using the little bit of lamplight spilling out from one of the tents. After hearing the noise made by the new arrivals, the barbarian woman turned around and glanced at them. Chu Lian took the chance to take a good look at her. She was a middle-aged woman with a face full of wrinkles. Her expression seemed indifferent. After a single apathetic glance at them, she turned her attention back to the jar she was heating over the fire. The tallest man amongst the 4 people who had brought Chu Lian here stepped forward first. He walked towards the tents and shouted something before speaking a string of words. Chu Lian couldn't understand what he was saying because he used the barbarian language. In a short moment, the tent flap was lifted and a head peeked out. The person within reached out to the man, and the man handed over the bag in his hands. The tent flap dropped back down. The person inside seemed to be satisfied with whatever he had been given, because he lifted up the tent flap once again and welcomed them in. Chu Lian was forced inside by the female rider. When they passed by the barbarian woman, she could smell something medicinal. She shot a glance at the jar heating over the fire and guessed that the barbarian woman was trying to brew some medicine. As expected, right before she entered the tent, she heard some coughing from the other tent. The tent that Chu Lian entered was much bigger than the other one. There were also some furs and blankets stacked up against the edge of the tent, so it seemed to be a sleeping area. There was a brazier placed in the center of the tent for warmth. In the harsh winter of the north, it would be impossible to sleep in a tent unless there was a brazier warming the tent from within. There was a terrible odor in the tent, most likely due to not airing it out for some time. The barbarian man who had welcomed them in spoke to the leader of her kidnappers in a fawning manner before retreating. It was clear that he had gone to the other tent to sleep. Chu Lian heard the barbarian man scolding someone outside, most likely the woman who was brewing medicine. Unfortunately, Chu Lian couldn't understand what they were saying. She waited for her 4 kidnappers to take off their cloaks before using the light of the fire in the tent to get a close look at them. There was only one woman, and the rest were men. The tall man who acted as the leader kept a thin mustache on his lip. It seemed like he was the oldest one of the group. The other 2 men were skinny and didn't have any special characteristics to them. The woman was taller than average and had thick lips. Basically, the 4 people had very ordinary appearances, the kind that you wouldn't be able to identify in a crowd. People with such appearances were most suited for spying and secret missions. Once the 4 kidnappers had taken off their cloaks, they each found a place to sit and shut their eyes in rest. The woman remained right next to Chu Lian. She bent down and shook out the fur blanket at the side and set it out nicely on the ground. She then turned to Chu Lian and spoke in monotone, "It's late. Honored lady should rest." Chu Lian didn't reject her offer and quickly curled up in the blanket. She then wrapped her own fox fur cloak around herself. Since the woman had initiated a conversation with her, she took the chance to ask, "Who sent you here to kidnap me?" The woman looked at her with lifeless eyes. There wasn't any change of emotion on her face at all. She pressed her thick lips together, clearly not willing to speak any longer. Chu Lian refused to give up and continued asking while staring at the woman, "Was it Prince Jean? The Wei family? Don't tell me it's Xiao Bojian." Chapter 391, Quick-witted, 2. Despite Chu Lian's attempts at probing her, the woman didn't show any reaction to the names Chu Lian mentioned. In the end, she completely ignored Chu Lian and laid down right next to her. She turned her back to Chu Lian and shut her eyes. Chu Lian stared at the canopy above her, wrapped up warmly in her fur cloak. It was so quiet in the tent that she could hear the non-stop coughing from the tent next door. She wanted to escape. Although her kidnappers hadn't mistreated her so far, they definitely had other plans for her. No matter who the real mastermind was, it wasn't going to bode well for her if she really ended up in that person's hands. Just her reputation alone would be ruined, no matter the outcome. So she had to do whatever she could to escape. Chu Lian didn't know how much time passed as she thought. As the wind howled outside, it was so quiet that she could hear a pin drop inside the tent. Her mind was so occupied with escaping that she didn't feel sleepy at all. She took a deep breath and gently shifted away the cloak around her. She carefully flipped over to her other side. She did this so carefully that she barely made a sound. However, as soon as she finished turning over, she was immediately met with the woman's cold glare. Chu Lian's eyes widened in fright. She gave out a bitter laugh inside. It seemed like it would be impossible to sneak out in front of these guys. Since she had already failed her attempt, Chu Lian didn't bother wasting any more effort and went to sleep. She would have to find another way to escape. Early in the morning of the next day, Chu Lian woke up abruptly. Since there wasn't any movement from her kidnappers, she didn't bother getting up just yet. It was only when the sound of the barbarians talking outside filtered into the tent that her kidnappers slowly opened their eyes. They exchanged glances. Even without speaking, it seemed like they were able to understand each other. The two shorter men pulled on their cloaks and left. Only the tall man and thick-lipped woman were left in the tent. The woman stood up and took out an iron kettle from the side. She dug up some snow right at the tent entrance and tossed them into the kettle before setting the kettle on top of the brazier in the tent. She was most likely going to heat up some hot water. Chu Lian quickly put on her own cloak and walked up to the woman. She looked up with her moist, wide eyes and said, "It's too stuffy in here. I want to go out for some fresh air." The woman shook her head. Chu Lian immediately frowned. She glanced at the woman in front of the brazier and decided not to speak another word more. She simply headed straight towards the tent entrance. However, before she had even reached the tent flap, she heard the sound of something flying through the air. In the next instant, there was already a sword stabbed into the ground at her feet. It would have cut right through her foot if it had landed 1 centimeter closer. Chu Lian froze in place and blanked out for a moment. When she finally regained her wits, cold sweat ran down her back. Her wide eyes seemed to turn into impenetrable depths for a short second before they quickly returned to normal. Chu Lian looked down at the sword that was at least 7 or 8 centimeters deep in the ground as her face flushed red with anger. "You! How dare you do that? Wait till I tell my husband Enchanting, I'll get him to kill you all." She was so indignant and furious that even her neck had turned red. Hopping mad, she pointed a trembling finger at the woman. A trace of contempt flashed across the thick-lipped woman's originally expressionless face. She hadn't expected that her master would actually like such a brainless woman. "Honored lady, I would advise you to be more obedient. Although we were ordered to assure your safety, if an accident were to happen, it's not something within our control." Chu Lian seemed to have been pushed to the edge by the woman's words. She continued pointing at the woman, unwilling to stop. "You had better not let me meet my husband then, or all of you will be dead." The thick-lipped woman could no longer hold back her disdain. She snorted, "Honored lady, I'll admit that Enchanting is pretty strong, but you seem to have forgotten where you are now. If you want your husband to take revenge for you, then you'll have to wait until you actually see him again." This time, Chu Lian looked like she had finally been dealt a blow. She looked down at the ground and slowly walked back to her original position. There was no more mention of going out of the tent from her as she sat back down on the blanket in a cross-legged pose. She wrapped her fox fur cloak around herself and curled up as if she was a pitiful, bullied little orphan. The woman shot another disdainful glare at her, eyes full of contempt. However, she had to admit that this honored lady did indeed have the looks to make a man fall deeply in love with her. Although her hair was in a mess from the rough journey through the night, the few loose strands of hair framing her face only accented how smooth and fair her skin was, like a piece of fine white jade. Her beauty invited onlookers to reach out to touch her and check if she was real. The way she looked all pitiful right now would also be able to tug at anyone's heartstrings. Unfortunately, there was nothing contained in that pretty little head of hers. She had probably been spoiled stupid when she was younger to be this naive. As a female spy, she hated the vapid, fragile flowers raised in the depths of noble houses the most. All they could do was to seduce men with their looks, and they were completely devoid of any practical skills or talent. During Chu Lian's fit of temper, the barbarian woman who had been brewing medicine the night before had passed by the tent with a wooden basin in hand. There were 3 words in Chu Lian's shout that made her freeze in place. Chu Lian had spoken in the official language of the capital of the Great Wu dynasty. The barbarian woman didn't actually understand that language at all, but she could recognize the words he changdi. Chapter 392, Quick-Witted. 3. The 2 men who had left the tent returned not too long after, each carrying a bag in their hands. One of them passed the bag he was holding to the thick-lipped woman next to Chu Lian. The 2 of them exchanged glances and the woman immediately began to open the package. Although Chu Lian had her head lowered, she was still watching the woman out of the corner of her eyes. The woman untied the package, loosening the ties and revealing the items inside. So the package was full of food. There was a frozen piece of meat about the size of 2 palms. It looked like mutton, judging by the color of it. There was a small handful of rice, a bowl of Chinese olives, and a porcelain bottle. Chu Lian could smell the faint scent of milk. It was probably either cow's milk or goat's milk. The woman looked down at the bag of food and blanked out for a moment. She then sighed, seemingly disappointed. Chu Lian watched as she took out the mutton and cut off a piece before grilling it right on top of the brazier. As for the rest of the items, she wrapped them back up into the package and threw it over to Chu Lian. She mocked, "If honored lady is hungry, go ahead and cook it yourself." The woman had originally treated Chu Lian with respect and extra care due to her master's orders. However, Chu Lian had truly angered her, so she wanted to torment this fragile noble lady. The 3 men glanced over for a moment before pretending that they hadn't seen anything. She technically wasn't violating any of their orders. Besides, they had worked together for a long time now, and they were unwilling to provoke her over such a small matter as this. It was easier to simply shut one eye to her actions. After a moment, Chu Lian couldn't hold back her hunger any longer. Her stomach made embarrassingly loud rumbles. She carefully glanced at the thick-lipped woman, who was still grilling mutton over the fire, and moved a few steps forward until she reached the bag of food. A slender, fair hand reached out from the fur cloak and tugged the bag over. Finally, 2 little hands peeked out and clumsily opened it up. When she saw what was inside, Chu Lian's eyes widened in astonishment. Her pink lips trembled. Full of disbelief, Chu Lian asked, You're only giving me this to eat?" The woman shot a sideways look at her and snorted. "I'd advise honored lady to dispense with that noble temper. If you don't want to eat this, then you can just go hungry." After she finished saying so, the thick-lipped woman seemed more refreshed. Her originally emotionless face was now tinged with a trace of joy. She flipped over the piece of mutton she was grilling and even took out a small piece of salt from somewhere in her clothes. After pinching and breaking off some of it with her fingers, she scattered it over the meat. In a short moment, the tent was filled with the delicious aroma of grilled mutton. Chu Lian stared at the mutton in a daze. She even gulped. The woman shot a look at her before taking the mutton off the fire. Using the dagger she always carried on her, she cut it up into smaller pieces and put them on a plate. Next, she picked up a piece and stuffed it into her mouth, shutting her eyes as if she was savoring its taste. Chu Lian couldn't help but swallow another mouthful of saliva. Actually, the mutton that the woman had cooked wasn't that delicious. The only seasoning she had used was salt, and the salt was just some coarse rock salt. All she had done was put the mutton on a fire to cook. How tasty could it be? She had eaten grilled mutton like this every day for too long, and she was tired of it. Even though the thick-lipped woman was rather tall, she was actually born in the south and didn't like eating mutton or beef. What she really wanted was some warm, soft rice porridge. Unfortunately, none of them could cook, so they could only make do like this every day. They could only hope to finish the mission sooner so they could go back to Sioux City and have a great feast in one of the restaurants there to reward themselves. The woman had purposely acted as if the meat was delicious in order to provoke the pampered honored lady. Surely those tender hands of hers wouldn't be able to cook the mutton. The thick-lipped woman felt soothed upon thinking of that. She finished up her meal in no time and sat back in a comfortable position, clearly not intending to move. Honored lady, we're not like those maidservants and manservants of yours. If you want to eat, you'll have to do it yourself. The spoiled, fragile young woman sitting in the corner was tightly gripping the bag of food with her head lowered. She looked as if she was holding back her tears and only barely enduring this hardship. Suddenly, Chu Lien lifted her head, lips pressed together, seemingly determined to do something. She walked over to the fire with the bag in hand. With her chin raised high, she looked disdainfully at the thick-lipped woman sitting not too far away and said, "Fine, I'll do it myself then." The thick-lipped woman sneered and turned away. She didn't have any sort of expectations at all for this honored lady and was simply waiting for her to make a fool of herself. Her eyes darted towards Chu Lien from time to time, waiting to see what spectacle she was going to make. However, her hopes were quickly dashed. Chapter 393, Quick-Witted 4. Chu Lien opened up the bag and found a clean earthenware pot in a corner of the tent. She set it over the fire and poured water inside. Then, she took out a dagger and sliced off a piece of mutton before carefully cutting it up into smaller cubes and throwing it into the bowl. Afterwards, Chu Lien quickly sliced the rest of the mutton and used some bamboo sticks to turn them into skewers, which she set aside. When the water in the pot had turned red with blood, she took out the mutton cubes and changed the water inside the pot. Next, she threw the small handful of rice and the mutton cubes back into the pot, adding more water with a small amount of goat's milk. After she was done with all that, she took out a small porcelain bottle from somewhere on her body and poured a light-colored seasoning into the bowl before covering up the pot. Now it was time for Chu Lien to start grilling the mutton skewers. Firstly, she patted the skewered mutton pieces so that the meat was spread evenly across the skewers. Next, she sprinkled a layer of her special seasoning over it and set the skewers to grill over the fire. Chu Lien didn't put the skewers right in the middle. Instead, she kept them at the edges of the brazier so she could use the peaks of the flames to grill the meat. Using the bamboo sticks, she carefully flipped the mutton skewers over. The fragrance of the meat soon filled the entire tent. The well-seasoned meat skewers couldn't be compared to the haphazardly grilled and salted mutton from before. It was the kind of aroma that came from street stalls selling barbecued skewers. Chu Lien's seasoning was lacking cumin. In this condition, it was only natural that her version of skewers couldn't match up to the more developed modern flavors. For the people of the Great Wu Dynasty, however, this was an irresistibly enticing food. By the time Chu Lien was done with her skewers, the mutton porridge in the pot was half done. The fragrance of it was also starting to drift out from the pot. Rice had a natural fragrance to begin with. When blanched mutton was added to the rice, together with some goat's milk, it created a wonderful aroma with a hint of milk. In contrast to the oily and flavorful smell of the grilled skewers, the porridge smelled clean and refreshing. It even evoked the warm feeling of home cooking. The four kidnappers were completely stunned. The thick-lipped woman was staring in disbelief. How had those simple, basic ingredients turned into such criminally enticing food in the hands of that pampered honored lady? She was suffering now. The tantalizing aroma of the food was constantly attacking her senses, and she couldn't stop it even if she wanted to. After experiencing such a heavenly fragrance, when she thought back to the half-cooked salted mutton pieces she had eaten earlier, she suddenly felt that her meal hadn't been fit for human consumption. The three men on the other side of the tent had already set down their food. Although they had all used the same ingredients, how was it possible that the results were so different? The three men weren't satisfied. They spat out the weird-tasting mutton in their mouths as inwardly cried tears of frustration. How could they continue eating their terrible cooking with that amazing smell in the air? It was as if they were watching someone else have a feast while all they had in their bowls was plain white porridge. How could they even have the mood to continue eating their food after that? Chu Lian took the skewers off the fire and pushed the meat off the bamboo sticks onto her little plate. By this time, the mutton porridge was pretty much done. She covered the lid of the pot with a cloth and lifted it slowly. Chu Lian could feel 4 pairs of eyes fixed on her as she lifted the pot lid. Her thumb shook a little, causing some tiny powdery substance to drop into the pot. Once the lid was lifted, a cloud of steam billowed up, concealing her action. Together with the steam, the fragrance of the mutton porridge filled the tent. Chu Lian didn't look at any of the kidnappers. She took out an earthenware bowl and filled half of the bowl with the savory mutton porridge before putting her grilled mutton slices on top. The steaming hot white porridge and the slightly charred grilled mutton slices were a feast to the eyes and the stomach. By now, any starving person would have likely charged forward to snatch the bowl from Chu Lian's hands. Of course, the 4 kidnappers weren't the kind to do that, but their appetites had been hooked by the smell of the food. They had been hiding in Liangzhou City for a number of months. All they had to eat every day was mutton or beef, or that damned Chinese olive porridge. The group hadn't been able to eat any plain rice porridge for incredibly long, let alone this delicious-looking mutton porridge. They were all secret agents, so they didn't have the time to learn how to cook. Of course, even if they were to try and learn, the standards of the Great Wu dynasty weren't all that great. Chu Lian took the bowl and returned back to her original position. She found some chopsticks and picked up a piece of grilled meat, putting it into her mouth immediately. She couldn't help but savor it. The meat had been cooked just right, to the point of perfection. A look of satisfaction appeared on Chu Lian's face, thanks to the delicious food. The onlookers were getting frantic from watching her eat, even the thick-lipped woman wasn't immune. In the end, it was the tall man with the thin mustache who lost his patience first. He casually glanced over at the pot sitting over the fire. There was still more than half of the porridge left. Chu Lian hadn't scooped out much of the porridge for herself. The layer of grilled meat on top of her bowl had made it seem like a lot more. The man gulped and walked over to Chu Lian's side. His usually blank expression had finally changed. His eyes scrunched up a little as if he was trying to smile. Unfortunately, since he never smiled, it had the opposite effect. "Honored lady, can I have a word with you?" Chu Lian finally looked up from her bowl. She made a questioning with doubt written all over her face. TL note, quick note before we get to the food porn. We use the exact same word for goat and a sheep in Chinese, and the author didn't specify which type of livestock she was referring to. So when you see mentions of goat/sheep in the story, I'm honestly making a best guess at which one. Do let me know if you find anything inconsistent with regards to this. From what I researched, the Mongolians, which I assume again is what the author means by the northerners/barbarians, raise both goat and sheep as livestock, but they raise more sheep. However, for this chapter and the previous one, there was mention of goat milk. I assume that we don't drink milk from sheep, so I went with goat for this one. As for the meat, here in Singapore, we use mutton to refer to meat from both goats or sheep to the point that I don't actually know what I'm eating when I eat mutton, but I found out that other countries like the US or UK use mutton exclusively for sheep and chavon for goat meat. I've decided to use mutton for any goat/sheep meat mentioned from now on, as that seems to be a more common term compared to chavon, so please take note of this ambiguity. Now on to the food porn. It looks delicious no matter what meat was used. XD mutton skewers, Xinjiang-style mutton porridge. Chapter 394, Murder, 1. The man gave an awkward cough before pushing on shamelessly. "Honored lady, could you give us the leftover porridge? As the man was asking this, all eyes in the tent were fixed on him in anticipation. Chu Lian frowned as if she hadn't expected such a question from him. Her brows were furrowed in thought for about 2 seconds before she finally made a decision. Under the man's intent gaze, she nodded unhappily. Okay, but you have to let me serve the porridge. The starving kidnappers would agree to anything as long as they could have the food. The 3 men glanced at the thick-lipped woman, taking pleasure in her misfortune, but they turned away after getting glared at. As expected, when they watched Chu Lian split the pot of porridge into 4 bowls, 3 of the bowls had about the same amount but the 4th bowl only had half as much. Chu Lian pointed out the smallest bowl of porridge with puffed cheeks, indicating that it was meant for the thick-lipped woman, before stomping off to one corner. The tall man patted the thick-lipped woman's shoulder before taking away the biggest bowl. The mutton porridge was just too fragrant. For people like them who hadn't even eaten plain rice porridge for the longest time, it was an irresistible gourmet dish. All of them took a deep breath and buried their heads in the porridge once they got their bowls. While they were occupied with their food, they didn't notice that Chu Lian hadn't eaten any of her porridge. She was only eating the grilled meat she had put on top of the porridge. That one bowl of porridge wasn't enough to fill them up. The 3 men and 1 woman wanted to lick their empty bowls clean. In their eyes, Chu Lian had eaten from the same pot of porridge, so there wasn't any chance of it being poisoned. Chu Lian slowly chewed through the food in her bowl. After 15 minutes, she sneaked a glance at the other people in the tent. They were leaning against a corner of the tent, completely down for the count. Excitement brewed in Chu Lian's chest. She did it. She did it in the end. She had first acted like a useless noble lady to lower their guard before using food to lure them into her trap. Chu Lian set down her bowl and patted her chest. She didn't dare to waste any second of her hard-earned time. First, she kept her dagger back where she had been hiding it and wrapped her fox fur cloak tightly around her. She then packed all the food she hadn't used to take away with her. Just as she walked up to the tent flap, she heard a weakened whisper from behind. Chu Lian froze and turned around, only to see the thick-lipped woman glaring at her fiercely. The woman used all of her strength to spit out, You actually drugged us." Chu Lian hadn't expected the woman to be awake. That was most likely because she had eaten less of the porridge than the others. However, even though she had managed to keep her consciousness, her body was already paralyzed and she didn't even have the strength to stand up. Chu Lian knew how strong the drug was supposed to be and she couldn't leave the woman awake in the tent. She gritted her teeth and turned around. The young lady picked up the sword next to the woman and slammed the hilt of it on the back of her head forcefully. With a grunt, the woman finally lost consciousness. Once the woman had fainted, Chu Lian collapsed on the ground. She threw away the sword in her hands as sweat ran down her forehead. She quickly forced herself to calm down and overcame the weakness in her legs. Grabbing her bag, she hurriedly left the tent. Actually, if she had been able to, it would have been better to eliminate them while they were still unconscious so she wouldn't be pursued. However, Chu Lian didn't dare to kill another human being. The modern world she had been raised in had shaped her worldview. She wasn't a cold and detached person as well. She couldn't commit murder, not because she was a saint, but because of her nature. The environment she had come from determined that she would never be able to do something like that. Once she left the tent, Chu Lian bumped right into another person, the barbarian woman she had seen outside the tent last night. Chu Lian tried to get away from her in a panic, but the barbarian woman caught hold of her wrist. She looked up at the woman with wide eyes in shock. A million thoughts flew through her mind as she bit her lip. However, since the barbarian woman hadn't said anything yet, she forced herself to calm down yet again and remain silent. If she made any sound and alerted the other people in this area, they would surely find out that she had drugged the 4 people in the tent. She wouldn't be able to control what happened afterwards. As Chu Lien stared at the barbarian woman in uncertainty and bewilderment, she finally spoke up with some difficulty. To Chu Lien's surprise, it was poorly pronounced Chinese. "I take you away." Chu Lien had expected the woman to shout and call the others, but never in her wildest dreams had she thought that the woman would say something like that. She had also used the official language of the Great Wu dynasty. Even though the pronunciation was a little off, Chu Lien had been able to understand it. Despite how amazed she was, Chu Lien didn't trust the barbarian woman immediately. There was no such thing as a free lunch in this world. She wasn't as gullible as her young appearance might lead others to believe. When the barbarian saw that Chu Lien was still frowning and that her eyes were filled with distrust, she got a little anxious. She quickly said another string of words. "He Changdi." There were no more words to describe the extent of Chu Lien's astonishment. She quickly asked, "Auntie, you know He Changdi?" Chapter 395, Murder, 2. The barbarian woman nodded furiously in answer and pulled Chu Lien to another side of the hollow in the hill. When they turned out of the main area, there was another recess with a layer of dry grass on the ground. A few horses and goats were tied up inside. The barbarian woman brought Chu Lien into the midst of the horses. She made some gestures at Chu Lien frantically. It took a long time for Chu Lien to finally understand what she meant. She slowly asked, "Auntie, do you want me to wait for you here?" Although the barbarian woman wasn't very familiar with the official language of the Great Wu, it seemed like she could still understand some simple words. The barbarian woman nodded in answer and pushed Chu Lien deeper into the herd of horses, using the larger horses to hide Chu Lien's tiny little frame. Once she had hidden Chu Lien, the barbarian woman quickly ran back to the tents. Luckily, the weather was terrible today and the temperatures outside were very low, so no one was walking around. When she walked over to the two tents, the barbarian woman paused and thought before gritting her teeth and entering Chu Lien's tent. The moment she saw the three men and one woman unconscious in the tent, she was startled. An instant later, she gathered her courage and checked if they were still breathing. Once she confirmed that they were only unconscious, the barbarian woman's eyes turned sharp. She took a sword from one of the men and slit the throats of all four of the kidnappers. It was only when the thick-lipped woman took her last breath that the barbarian woman sat on the ground, panting in fear. However, there was no time to waste. She forced herself up and walked over to the tent flap, first listening for any movement outside and confirming that there was no one there. Once she was sure that it was clear, she lifted the tent flap and walked out. Chu Lien squatted amongst the horses for 30 minutes until the barbarian woman ran back over with two other people. Chu Lien quickly went up to welcome them. It was only when they got closer that she realized the barbarian woman was holding on to two boys. The older one looked about 17 or 18 years old. The younger one was skinny and dark and looked about 10. The barbarian woman spoke some gibberish to the older boy, who then nodded and looked at Chu Lien. "Miss, my ama says that we have to leave this place immediately. We'll be in trouble if anyone finds out." While the older boy's pronunciation wasn't that accurate either, at least communication wouldn't be a problem. The four of them didn't dare to stay for even a second longer there. Since Chu Lien still didn't know how to ride a horse, in the end, the two boys shared a mount while the barbarian woman and Chu Lien shared another. The horses quickly vanished into the boundless horizon of the endless wind and snow. In just a few seconds, they could no longer be seen from the hill. During their journey, Chu Lien got a rough understanding of the situation from the older boy. The barbarian woman was called Yuri Han and the older boy was called Meyer Yen. The younger boy's name was Narisong. They were a family of mother and sons. The two boys were both sick and Narisong's illness was bad enough that he had to drink medicine every day. They had come from an ordinary family of herders. The boys' father had passed away early on, so Yuri-han had raised them all by herself. However, the boys had been afflicted with illness and life was hard for them. Even though Yuri-han knew that the two boys weren't suffering from any major disease, they didn't have the right medicine to treat their illnesses, so they had been suffering all this while. They hadn't been staying in the natural hollow of the hillside at first, but somewhere else. Winter had come too abruptly this year. The snowstorms had crushed the tent they were living in and half of the goats that they depended on had frozen to death. In order to keep her sons alive, Yuri-han had brought her sons away to that hillside. She had used their remaining goats to barter for their stay there. Yuri-han and her sons lived there for half a month before Chu Lien came by. After listening to this, Chu Lien finally realized that the two tents on the hillside had been like an inn. The owner of the place rented out space to passers-by. The leader of the kidnappers had given the owner of the tents a bag of something, like a fee for staying there. Luckily, Yuri-han was a daughter of the grasslands. She had lived on the grasslands for decades. Even in the endless plains of winter, she could still determine which direction to head in. Close to 4 hours after Chu Lien and Yuri-han had left, a small group of men on horses came to the hillside. The owner of the tents came out to welcome them with a smile, but was mercilessly kicked away. The man on top of the horse looked down on the owner of the tent and barked out something harshly, causing the owner of the makeshift inn to scramble up from the ground, leading the newcomers to the tent that Chu Lien had stayed in. "Sir, the people you're looking for are here. This lowly one saw someone come out this morning to take some bags." The leader of the newly arrived party harumphed and leaped off his horse. He strode over to the tent flap and was about to open it when the unmistakable metallic scent of blood hit his nose. The man's expression changed and he ripped open the tent flap. For corpses laid inside the tent, the ground awash with their blood. Due to the low temperatures, the red liquid had already coagulated on the ground. There was no sign of honored Lady Jeannie in the tent. TL note, Yuri-han and Myrian were previously translated as Wulihan and Murin in Pinyin. I've changed it after doing more research on Mongolian names and converting the Chinese words to Mongolian. That sounds about right and much better than leaving their names in Pinyin. As for Narasong, there was no good translation of his name available, so I kept it as is. Do let me know via Discord or at Timeban on Discuss if you have a better idea of what their names should be. Chapter 396, She's Gone, 1, Where is she? The leader of the group hadn't expected to see his comrades' corpses upon entering the tent. He kicked the owner of the tents to the ground. The owner was scared silly. His whole body trembled as he knelt. Those were people lying dead in that tent. Not just some livestock. The leader stared at the corpses with a grave expression. He immediately summoned his subordinates, 10, 13, chase after her. The rest of you, follow me back to Sioux City. He Chengdi was trudging his way back with the supply group. Even with the snowboat, they couldn't go any faster. The horses needed to rest and the snows had never stopped. The weather in the north was actively trying to kill them. Xiao Hongyu jumped into the warm pen of the snowboat. He immediately rubbed his body all over and warmed himself at the brazier for a long time before finally coming back to life. He covered his reddened and frozen ears with his hands, complaining, "It's so cold outside. Brother He, how many more days before we reach our camp?" He Chengdi had slid his gloves back on upon seeing Xiao Hongyu enter the pen. "Hongyu, rest here with Brother Zhang. I'll go take a look outside. If my guess is right, we should be able to reach camp in 2 days at the most, going at this speed." Xiao Hongyu heaved a sigh of relief upon hearing He Chengdi's words. He never wanted to pass his days getting frozen outside anymore. Zhang Mai was grilling some beef slices over the fire. While cooking the meat, he shook his head with regret. Although we used the same beef, but how is it that the ones I grilled are so different from sister-in-laws? Changdi had been about to step out of the warm pen. When he heard Zhang Mei's mumbling, he completely stopped moving for an instant. Xiao Hongyu shot a disdainful look at the beef slices that Zhang Mei was grilling. When he saw that half of every slice was already completely charred black, he rolled his eyes. He would rather starve to death than eat Brother Zhang's cooking. It was too scary. Sanlang sat on his horse's back and stared out into the pure white horizon that stretched as far as the eye could see. There was a black veil attached to his hood to make his vision a little obscured. When traveling over a snow-covered surface, if the human eye continued looking at the blank white expanse, their eyes would be hurt by ultraviolet rays reflecting off the white snow and they might become snowblind. This was especially true for the grasslands of the north where everything turned white the moment it snowed. The thin black veil acted as a rather effective protective shield for his eyes so he wouldn't become snowblind. The veil was similar to the modern protective snow goggles. Ever since he had given each soldier in his group a single piece of black muslin, not a single one of them had suffered from snow blindness. This simple solution had been something that Chu Lian had mentioned to him offhandedly. Changdi gripped the reins in his hands tightly and felt the tension from the leather gloves covering his hands. These gloves were different from the standard gloves issued by the army. Each finger of the glove was sewn separately and there was an extra tough layer of leather added to the palm. The whole glove was not only waterproof, it was also extra warm inside thanks to a thin layer of fleece. Compared to the simple gloves given by the army, which only had 2 parts for the thumb and 4 fingers, it was much more convenient and practical for use. Xiao Hongyu had been drooling over his gloves for a long time. He looked down at the gloves and recalled what Chu Lian had said to him when she had given him the gloves, "Keep these. They're better than what they issue in the army." They weren't just better. He didn't even have to take them off when he was fighting in close quarters. Changdi abruptly stiffened up. He shut his eyes, as if trying to pull himself out of this sweet dreamscape. What was going on? Why was Chu Lian like a constant shadow by his side? The most disgraceful part of it was that he didn't hate that kind of feeling at all. He even continuously replayed memories in his mind as if addicted to them. For some reason, he still remembered every single word that the Chu Lian of this lifetime had said to him, down to the simplest greeting. Sanlang's thin lips pressed together tightly as the depths of his eyes turned into the fathomless sea. His emotions crashed against his heart like the fierce waves of the azure ocean. A crack appeared in his blank mask and turned into a bitter smile. He had really been poisoned by Chu Lian's drug. That woman must be eating and drinking happily in the main camp while he was out fighting for the lives of the 50,000 border troops. She just had a strange kind of power. No matter where she ended up, she was able to live just as well. This gave rise to a feeling of dissatisfaction in Sanlang's heart, as if he had been thwarted by her tricks and half of his heart had been stolen away. Just as his thoughts were about to meander into daydreams, a few black dots appeared on the horizon. As the dots grew bigger and bigger, Sanlang's brows drew together slightly. He waved at the troops behind him and a small group broke off to pursue those little dots. Soon, he could see the scouting group and 3 additional people headed their way. Once the newcomers had drawn close, Changdi recognized the leader straight away. He was one of the guards that Princess Wei had sent to keep Chu Lian safe. For no reason at all, Sanlang's heart sank and he got a bad feeling. Li Xing ran up to Changdi and immediately raised his hands in a cupped first greeting. Without giving himself time to catch his breath, he panted as he reported, "Third young master, honored lady has an urgent message for you. 1 day ago, the Tuhuns launched a major offensive against the Northern Army." "What?" Changdi's expression turned stormy. He quickly took the message from Li Xing's hands and opened it up. Chu Lian's letter was short, but it explained all the necessary details he had to know about the whole situation in a concise and succinct manner. She told Changdi to return as fast as he could to the main camp once he read the letter. The stores of the Northern Army had already run empty. The Tuhans might really defeat them if the supplies didn't reach in time. Although both of them knew what was going to happen from their previous lives, there had been too many changes in this world. Neither of them could guarantee that events would happen exactly the same as they had in the past life. They weren't as silly as to leave the decision up to fate. That would be completely brainless. Chapter 397, She's Gone, too. Changdi slipped the letter into his clothes once he was done reading. The crease between his sharp brows deepened. He sent out orders to cancel the scheduled break for tonight and to rush back to camp at the fastest speed they could manage. Changdi and his party sprinted back to the border camp without any break for a whole day and night. The original 2-day journey was shortened to a single day and they managed to reach just as the border army had reached breaking point. The Secretary of the Northern Army personally led a group of men out to welcome them back to camp, before ordering the cooks to prepare a full meal for all of the soldiers on the front lines. Now that they were well fed, the troops under Great General Qian's command turned into ruthless warriors. They quickly took back the upper hand and mounted a counterattack against the Tuhan army. Their equipment was a few magnitudes better than the Tuhans in the first place. They had only been held back by their supply problem earlier. Now that they didn't have to worry about their rations, the morale of the army swelled. After getting their well-deserved fill of food, all of the northern border troops revealed their fighting strength, fiercely attempting to make up for their lack of performance in the earlier clashes. Now that the border troops' morale had been stoked, there was no longer any uncertainty about their victory. General Qian admired Changdi even more now. He hadn't expected this junior noble from House Jingan to have shown off such capability. Needless to say, Changdi's timely delivery of supplies was one of the most important factors that had brought about their victory. The Tuhan army was in decline now. The strict and inflexible General Qian bent his own rules and decided to send Changdi out to the battlefield right this moment. There was close to no danger now in heading to the battlefields. Changdi might even be able to add another achievement to his belt if he went out with the last wave of soldiers to clean up the Tuhans. Furthermore, he had already earned plenty of merit from contributing the snowboat blueprints and delivering supplies. The person who made the most contribution to the Northern War efforts would likely be none other than him. This was going to be an easy task. Anyone else would probably have agreed to it on the spot. However, Sanlang rejected General Qian's rare good intentions. It wasn't because he was stupid, but because Chu Lian had gone missing. In a certain tent in the main camp, a group of people were kneeling on the ground. The ones in the front were Wenqing, Wenlan, and Manager Qin. Changdi sat at the head of the tent with a stormy expression and looked down upon the kneeling servants, holding back the urge to slap each and every one of them. What happened? How was third young madam taken away? Anger flooded his chest, overwhelming him as he choked on his frustration. Wasn't that wicked woman usually infallible? She even had guards by her side this time. Where was the quick wit that she always turned against him? She had actually let herself get kidnapped. Wenqing and Wenlan had been serving Sanlang ever since they were young girls. Although they didn't get to meet him much, they had never seen him looking so fearsome before. The pressure he exuded was like a mountain pressing over their heads. None of them dared to look up at their master at all. If they even glanced at him, they might be sent down to hell immediately. The servants were all extremely worried about their mistress, so they didn't hide any bit of what had happened. They reported the whole chain of events that had led to Chu Lian getting abducted. Changdi gripped the arms of his chair hard. His eyes narrowed dangerously. Although his gaze seemed to be focused on the tent flap, it didn't seem like it either. No one dared to say a word. They tried to make their breaths as silent as possible. Sanlang suddenly thought of the snowboat. He remembered how Xiao Bojian had been so desperate to get the blueprints for the snowboat and the jealous and begrudging look that Xiao Bojian had given him when he had left Su City with the supplies. Then the Tuhuns had suddenly attacked. In his previous life, even though he had been hurt by the wicked Chu Lian, he had been one of Xiao Bojian and Chu Lian's closest friends. Later on, he had found out in one way or another that Xiao Bojian had some sort of power hidden behind the scenes. He had more people backing him than the one old duking that everyone else could see. He had also been able to get a foothold in court so quickly, due to that mysterious power he had behind him. He Changdi hadn't touched Xiao Bojian at all after reviving in this life because he knew that Xiao Bojian was more than he seemed on the surface and that he was going to be a tough nut to crack. As for Chu Lian's sudden disappearance, he didn't even have to guess to know who the mastermind was. He Sanlang clenched his fists. Xiao Bojian. Did he really think that he would be just as easy to bully as he had been in his past life? The Chu Lian of this lifetime was his wife. No one else would be able to take her away from him. He Changdi already had some plans formed in his mind. He summoned Liuyue with a cold expression on his face, then sent a message to Prince Jin via Tang Yan about searching for Chu Lian in Liangzhou. After he had returned to the main camp, he hadn't even changed into a fresh set of clothes before setting off to lead the investigation personally. Even though he kept his cool on the outside and seemed almost heartless about his wife's disappearance, no one could see the mix of anxiety, upset and heartache in his heart right now. He kept himself busy and numb so that his thoughts wouldn't wander in bad directions. Chapter 398, Hanging On to Life, 1. Once General Qian heard that He Sanlang had rejected his mission, his first reaction was disappointment. After a moment, his next reaction was to grin with frustration from the brat's actions. No matter what, He Sanlang was an upstanding man who followed his own moral compass. He hadn't been tempted by the easy chance to gain merit and had instead chosen to save his own wife first. Great General Qian only respected him even more for that choice. It was more human to be carried away by one's emotions. If a man could abandon his wife and children for the sake of chasing achievement or merit, then even if he had great talent, General Qian would prefer that he simply vanish without having those talents recognized. He Changdi personally led his men in the investigation. After half a day of searching, they finally got some leads. He Sanlang's tense, statue-like face finally loosened and warmed up a little. He took the men under him who were the most skilled in martial arts and rushed all the way through the night to the place the leads pointed to. The harsh winds were accompanied by icy snowflakes, cutting like razors and jagged stones across his face. However, He Changdi acted as if he couldn't feel any of it and urged his mount onwards across the snow-white plains fading into twilight. He realized that he couldn't think of Chu Lian at all. The moment she appeared in his thoughts, it felt as if someone had stabbed him in the heart. It hurt a lot. He Changdi suddenly felt that he had turned into something beyond his control, something scary and fearsome. If anything happened to that wicked woman, even killing every single person wouldn't be able to ease the hatred in his heart. The mix of emotions in his chest made him uneasy. Ever since his reincarnation, he had thought that there would only be hatred left for him in this lifetime, that he would be able to remain calm and detached towards anything. However, in these mere 6 months, he had experienced a greater swath of emotions than he had ever felt in his previous life. And now the person who had brought all that to him was possibly in danger. He Changdi raised the whip in his hands and directed it at his horse's rump. He had to go faster, even faster. He wanted to fly right to Chu Lian's side and pull her into his embrace and comfort her. Xiao Hongyu, Li Yu, Li Xing, and the rest of the party behind him could only grit their teeth and do their best to follow upon watching him whip his horse on faster and faster. A hill finally came into sight before them, surrounded by darkness and the swirling snowy winds. By the time He Changdi and his party had reached the 2 tents in the middle of the hill, night had fallen. The owner of the tents had already been frightened half to death by the sudden visitors earlier that day. Now that another party brimming with a ferocious aura had come, he was overcome with misery. He scrambled over to welcome them in a panic and tried his best to show them an accommodating smile. He raised his arm, prepared to welcome the icy-looking man in front with a proper Han salute. However, before he could, the owner was immediately pushed over onto the snow by that same handsome man. Changdi couldn't wait for the man to speak. He strode forward with great urgency and quickly pulled aside the tent flap of one of the tents. There were more than 10 makeshift beds on the floor, with people of varying ages. He looked at face after face, but the woman he wanted to find wasn't there. A pang of disappointment flooded his chest. He quickly walked over to the other tent. His hand trembled as it reached out for the tent flap, but he finally found his determination in the next second. The tent flap flew up and Changdi stared into the tent. The sight of it empty was like a dagger piercing into his chest. His heart had been emptied of all hope in the blink of an eye. Changdi stared at the emptiness in a daze, his mind completely blank. The sourness and bitterness in his heart was overwhelming. Xiao Hongyu, who had followed in behind Changdi, was a little stunned by the scene. However, he was just an observer to this and thus was able to keep his reason. He reached out to pat Sanlang's shoulder and slid past Sanlang to enter the tent first. When he looked around, he quickly realized that something was not quite right. Xiao Hongyu squatted down in a corner and felt around. His hands were immediately met with a layer of dark red earth. When he lifted his hand to his nose and took a sniff, Xiao Hongyu was met with a familiar rusty smell. Anyone who had been on a battlefield would recognize it as the smell of fresh blood. Xiao Hongyu's heart sank. With a grave expression, he said, "Brother come and take a look over here." Changdi immediately strode over to Xiao Hongyu's side. When he noticed the bloodstains in the corner of the tent, his entire body stiffened up. His lips were pressed so tightly together that he couldn't speak. Xiao Hongyu sighed inwardly. It looked like Brother really cared a lot about honored Lady Jeannie. Brother don't think too much for now. Well, go and question the owner of this place. Maybe it's someone else's blood. It was at this moment that the owner of the tents was dragged inside. After a round of questioning which revealed that Chu Lian had escaped, the cloud of despair over Changdi finally lifted. The owner of the tents could tell that he couldn't afford to offend these people. He personally brought Changdi and the rest to where he had buried the 3 men and 1 woman. Changdi examined the kidnappers' clothing closely. When he found a tattoo inked in the same spot on all of the kidnappers, his brows furrowed. Now he was certain that Xiao Bojian was the one behind this incident. As careful as Chu Lian had been, because she had left in such a rush, she had still left some traces behind. Changdi had brought one of the scouts skilled in reconnaissance from the northern border troops. They followed the traces and continued on their journey. Chapter 399, Hanging On to Life, 2. Even with the thick fox fur cloak around her, the icy northern winds battered her body with snow and stole away whatever warmth she originally had. Her face and hands were already numb from the cold. Chu Lian looked up at the darkening sky, face worn with worry. Although they were able to bear with the low temperatures during the day, if they didn't find a place to rest for the night soon, they would surely freeze to death out here in the open. She couldn't determine any sense of direction in the middle of this white plain. Furthermore, she didn't know if there were any pursuers on their tail. Chu Lian panted for breath as she turned to Meyer Yen. Meyer Yen, could you ask your Ama if she can find a place to sleep for the night? If we continue like this, we'll freeze to death. The teen nodded and turned to Yurihan. Chu Lian listened as he spoke to her in the barbarian language. Meyer Yen nodded at his mother before turning back to Chu Lian and reporting what he had found out with a frown. Sister Chu, Amma said that there's no place suitable to rest nearby. We have to walk for another 5 kilometers before we can find a place to rest. Chu Lian sucked in a gasp of air upon getting such an answer. 5 kilometers. In the army, when soldiers were forced to march at their fastest on a normal road surface, they would cover about 500 kilometers or so in a day. For a normal person, they would be able to walk 25 to 30 kilometers at the most. Although they had horses right now, they were in the middle of the icy north in knee-deep snow. Their horses could go 15 or 20 kilometers in a day without food or water. Now that the sky was already starting to turn dark, the closest place they could make camp was still 5 kilometers away. It was impossible to reach there before night fell and the temperatures dropped. Chu Lian turned to look at the middle-aged Yuri Han and discovered that she had a similar expression of anxiety. However, they had no other choice but to try their best to survive out on the grasslands. They didn't have any fire, and the ground was covered in a thick layer of snow. Any firewood they might be able to find was likely already damp and moldy. The white horizon spread out before them without an end. There wasn't even an outcrop where they could take shelter, so the experienced Yuri Han was also helpless in the face of the cruel reality of nature. Their whole group seemed to have understood the danger they were in. Death was like a silent shadow slowly creeping over them. The atmosphere between the four of them turned dead and tense. Yuri Han was starting to regret bringing Chu Lian out. She hadn't expected the snow-covered grasslands to be this hard to traverse. A place they could normally reach in a day of travel now took twice as long. This was under the assumption that they didn't lose their way. Chu Lian's wide eyes stared out into the falling snow around them. Her dry lips pressed together as a spark of resolution lit up in her eyes. She didn't realize that this subtle action she took in the face of emergency was actually rather similar to Yichang's. The sky darkened abruptly, and the limited warmth of the day went along with the light. Chu Lian could now feel that her body was slowly trembling. She suddenly patted Yuri Han's shoulder and said, "Amma, we can't continue going on like this. Even if we keep going for the whole night, we won't be able to reach a place where we can safely pass the night." Chu Lian's simple words had obviously gotten through to Yuri Han. Yuri Han lowered her head and started sobbing lowly. She spoke in the barbarian language with a tone full of regret. Meyer Yen was also upset. He hugged his brother's thin frame tightly and translated his Amma's words. "Sister Chu, Amma says that she has let you down. She shouldn't have been so reckless." Chu Lian focused her gaze on the mother and sons before her, the gears in her head turning. She had learned all sorts of survival knowledge in the modern world. Surely there was something that could help get them through this emergency. There must be something. She just hadn't remembered it yet. Chu Lian gripped the reins in her hands tightly and sunk into deep thought. When Meyer Yen didn't hear any reply from her and noticed the blank expression on her face, he thought that she was blaming Amma. He lowered his head in guilt. The northern wind howled in her ears, accompanied by the steady beat of the horse's hooves landing on the snow. The horse under her suddenly snorted. It wavered, as if it could no longer endure the burden on its back. Chu Lian's attention was drawn by the horse. An idea flashed in her mind. She had a way for them to survive the night. Chu Lian's eyes lit up like the glittering stars in the expanse of night sky above them. "Amma, Meyer Yen, I know how we can survive the night." Meyer Yen had already accepted his fate. When he heard Chu Lian's words, his eyes widened in shock. "Sister Chu, are you serious?" Even Yuri Han turned to Chu Lian with eyes full of hope. As long as there was a way to survive, who would really let themselves die? Yuri Han was no exception. Furthermore, she had 2 young sons. If there really was hope for survival, she would even sacrifice her own life in exchange for a fighting chance for her sons. Chu Lian nodded with certainty. Although her voice was soft and pleasant, the composure she held was able to calm the others and left no room for doubt or mistrust. We can't go on any further. It's about to turn even darker and the temperature is only going to drop further. Let's stop here first and use the horses as a shield against the winds. We have to eat something and recover our strength. Her solution for their survival was going to require a lot of their energy. They had to rest and conserve their energy now. The horses had been carrying the weight of 2 people each for some time, and they likely wouldn't be able to last much longer. Chapter 400, Reunion 1. The 4 of them got off their mounts, which Chu Lian then led to one side. She told Yuri-Han to stand at a position where they would be shielded from the wind before taking out some of the food they had packed into the cloth bags hanging on the horses. They leaned against the horses and tried to warm themselves with the horses' body heat. After distributing the food, they forced themselves to eat it to preserve their energy. Chu Lian gulped down some goat's milk and explained her idea to them while they were eating. Meyer Yan had been eating peacefully at first, but after hearing Chu Lian's solution, his eyes widened in astonishment. He said anxiously, "Sister Chu, we can't do that. These 2 horses are the last thing we can count on. Without them, we'll never be able to walk out of these plains on our feet alone." Chu Lian knew that Meyer Yan was speaking the truth. She sucked in a deep breath of the bracing cold air around her and rubbed the flank of the horse she was leaning against before sighing. "Meyer Yan, take a good look at this horse. Even if we don't use my solution, these 2 horses won't be able to live till the next morning. Furthermore, the horses needed food. In their rush to leave the hill and due to Yuri-Han's mistake in estimating the distance they could travel, they hadn't brought any feed for the horses at all. Without food, the horses wouldn't be able to go on for much longer. The condition of the 2 mounts they hadn't been very good in the first place. Meyer Yan turned to look at the horse behind them. He reached out to touch the horse and found that its body was trembling and that it was in low spirits. It wasn't a good sign. He was a man of the plains and he herded goats for a living, so he definitely loved the animals he took care of. Unless he had no other choice, he would never hurt a horse. Meyer Yan shut his eyes, looking pained. Finally, he nodded. He knew too that killing these 2 horses was probably their best chance at survival at this point. They would only be able to survive in the deadly cold night by doing so. Chu Lian let out a breath of relief after successfully convincing Meyer Yan. Horses seem to have human-like intelligence, so she wouldn't have chosen to do so either except in extenuating circumstances. She looked up at the endless horizon of white snow. As the day's light slowly faded into darkness, she stuffed the last bite of jerky into her mouth and said, "Let's start after we're done eating." Meyer Yan nodded with his fists clenched. While eating, he explained Chu Lian's idea to his mother and brother. Yuri-Han was more cool-headed than her son. Even though Chu Lian's idea was just a short-term solution and they would be facing an even more troubling situation the next morning, they would freeze to death this very night if they didn't do so. Once everyone was in agreement, they started preparing everything they needed. Luckily, there were already 2 swords inside the sacks hanging off the horses. Chu Lian would have gone mad if they only had her tiny dagger to kill the horses with. Naturally, it was Yuri-Han and Meyer Yan who handled the actual killing. They had lived with livestock and horses for years, so they were familiar with slaughtering animals. They knew how to kill a horse with the least amount of suffering. Once the 2 horses were lying motionless on the snow, even Chu Lian couldn't help but shed tears for their plight. It was getting darker and darker now, and the temperature was dropping. Chu Lian had to hurry up. She and Yuri-Han dug out all the organs from the horses' abdomens and piled them up to one side on the snow. They laid the 2 horses on their sides. Once all the innards were gone, Chu Lian and Yuri-Han first helped the youngest Narasong into the horse's body. Meyer Yan then entered the body himself, setting his back to the opening while hugging Narisong. Chu Lian pushed the pile of innards over the opening, covering the two boys. The other horse was to be her resting place for the night, along with Yurihan. Luckily, she and Yurihan were both small in stature and slim. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to fit into one horse together. Chu Lian and Yurihan gestured at each other for some time before she finally persuaded Yurihan to lay on the inside. After Yurihan had entered the horse's body, Chu Lian squatted down and pushed her way in. Luckily, she still had her fox fur cloak around her, so it wasn't too cold for her even though she was on the outside. It smelled terrible inside the horse's belly. Blood and other fluids dripped onto her face. However, for the sake of survival, she had to bear with it. Changde's heart sank even more the further they traveled while chasing the traces of Chu Lian and her party. It was already completely dark by now. All of the men who had come out with Changde were hiding inside the warm pen of the snowboat. Changde opened up the flap a little to look out into the darkness with a grave expression. Damn it, it was already night. Out on the plains in winter, without anything to keep them warm, the dark of the night was the harbinger of death. They had a specialized guide with them who was an old barbarian who had lived on the grasslands for decades. The abnormally serious Xiao Hongyu turned to ask the old guide, "Is there any place to rest nearby?" The old guide pursed his lips and spoke honestly, "There isn't any place to rest for 5 kilometers or so from here. It will take at least 2 days or more to get out of these endless plains." Hearing that made the expression on He Sanlang's face turn even more icy. A guard on the outside reported, "Young master, there are some tracks ahead." Changde's voice came out a little rough, "Keep following the tracks." After the guard made a sound of agreement, he passed down the orders. If not for the snowboat and the warming pen, even trained elite guards like them wouldn't be able to travel normally in these dark and snowy conditions. Changde had checked the traces that Chu Lian and her party had left back at the hill. After questioning the owner of those tents, he knew exactly what Chu Lian had with her when she had escaped. How were 4 people and 2 horses going to survive out in this kind of night?